1. A little miracle. When it came, the letter was brief. It was going to change my life. But I didn't know that at the time. Would I please arrange to see this young man called David? He needed a neurological opinion. Unusually, he'd suffered a stroke in his 30s but thankfully had made an excellent physical recovery. In fact, within a few days he'd been walking and talking without difficulty, looking for all the world as if nothing had happened. However, it soon became apparent that all was not well. David's behavior had changed dramatically. Previously he'd been a very outgoing, highly motivated extrovert, but now he seemed entirely different. Although he'd returned to his job as a financial consultant quite quickly after his stroke, he was disinterested in the work that he'd only recently found so stimulating. He appeared bored. He lacked enthusiasm. Even when he was fired a few weeks later, he seemed quite indifferent. He couldn't be bothered to claim unemployment benefit and was now living with some close friends. Although they had initially been happy to help out, they were fast becoming irritated with him. David had apparently been a highly gregarious person who always took the initiative at the center of his social circle, but now he was quite hard work, disengaged, distant, and aloof. Exasperatingly, he made very little contribution to the upkeep of the house. In fact, he did nothing all day, simply waiting for his friends to return in the evening to cook for and entertain him. His very inactivity made him annoying. He'd become a stranger to his closest acquaintances. In his referral letter, his general practitioner went on to say that he'd started David on an antidepressant, thinking his behavior was due to low mood, but the medication had no impact. The doctor was puzzled. Could we sort out why David had become so inactive, so dull? I winced. What did this doctor think neurologists did? Turn boring people into interesting ones? Our specialty is usually the last point of referral for many unexplained symptoms. But this seemed absurd. Still, there were some features in this story that were distinctly unusual. First, it's relatively rare for a young person to suffer a stroke. Then there was the change in behavior. This man was apparently so indifferent that he couldn't get around to claiming Social Security benefits. That was highly peculiar too. But if David wasn't depressed, what was wrong with him? When he had suffered his stroke, David had been admitted to one of our sister hospitals, so I knew it should be possible for me to track down his investigations from my computer. A few clicks later, and I was gazing at his MRI brain scans. At first, they looked pretty normal, but as I scrutinized them more closely I saw that he'd suffered not one stroke, but two. There they were. Two very small holes, one on each side of the brain, almost symmetrically located in the deep nuclei known as the basal ganglia. This was definitely odd. Strokes don't normally occur as a brace like this. Usually, one side of the brain is affected because a stroke involves either the blockage of a blood vessel in the brain, referred to as an ischemic stroke, or the bursting of a blood vessel. Hemorrhage, to affect both sides of the brain, means that the mechanism might involve blood clots that have originated from a distant location, e.g. the heart, and lodged in two different blood vessels, one on either side of the brain. I worked through the list of blood and heart tests that David had undergone, but all had failed to reveal a cause. It wasn't surprising that he'd recovered physically very rapidly because these really were very small strokes. But why had he become so apathetic afterwards? The story was curious. There were far too many unanswered questions. I decided we ought to see David soon. I closed my eyes. It had been a very long clinic and the heat didn't help. From the open window, there was the throb of an air conditioning unit, which was no doubt keeping some other part of The hospital cool. We'd seen a lot of people that afternoon and I was feeling drained. To my disappointment, my odd patient hadn't turned up. This was the outpatients clinic at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery situated in London's Queen Square, known affectionately for generations as the Square. This hospital had been home to some of the pioneers of neurology. One matched, perhaps only by the Salpêtrière, its rival establishment in Paris. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the Square had made enormous contributions to the understanding of brain disorders. And, by studying patients with neurological illnesses, the clinicians who worked there came to provide highly influential views on how human brains function. That kind of historical tradition can, occasionally, weigh heavily on modern doctors. From time to time, we're reminded of just how impressive those pioneers were. They had diseases named after them, and their systematic way of examining patients has been passed down from generation to generation since. We still use the methods they developed to help make a diagnosis. However, in the modern health service, we don't often have time to think about what we owe our illustrious colleagues from the past. We're simply too busy getting on with seeing the next case. This afternoon was different. My potentially interesting patient hadn't turned up. It was a shame, but it wasn't my fault, and maybe it was fortunate. I now had a bit more time to finish some letters on the patients I had seen. Nonetheless, something niggled. Why hadn't he shown up? I stepped out of the consulting room. The television in the waiting area was playing a news report of an anti-government protest in Syria as I walked past. I didn't think much of it. The Arab Spring had produced many surprises, and this presumably was going to be yet another one. Nobody then could have foreseen how far-reaching the impact of these distant events was going to be. With Europe first welcoming Syrian refugees with open arms and then almost immediately shutting its doors to them as outsiders. But my mind that afternoon was focused on something far more parochial. This patient didn't turn up. Did he cancel? I asked the receptionist. No. Do you want me to discharge him? She replied eagerly. The National Health Service waiting lists are long, and no-show patients like this just add to the time other people have to wait to be seen. I could understand why she was so keen to take him off our list. Oh no. Do you have his phone number? Please? I don't know what made me ask, but I was now far too interested in his story. Somehow, I had been sucked into the tale of this man who had suddenly become boring. To my surprise, the telephone rang only twice before it was picked up. Is that David? I asked. Yeah, came the reply. It was a matter of fact, prolonged drawl, a disinterested voice, one that seemed accustomed to saying very little, somehow minimalist without even trying. David, I'm calling from the hospital. I'm the neurologist you were supposed to see. You were due to be at my clinic this afternoon. Any reason why you couldn't make it? There was a long pause. Oh, sorry about that. It just seemed like a long way to go. I see. Look, David, I think it's important we see you. Are you free tomorrow morning? Another long silence. Okay, I can do that. Are you sure you'll come along? I asked. I'll be waiting to see. Just you. Okay, where and when? Came the response after a few seconds. It was grudging. I could almost see the shrug of the shoulders, as if I was somehow infringing on his precious time. He didn't seem at all excited. I found that mildly irritating, even though we try not to show it. Doctors suffer the vanity of thinking patients might need us, might even want to see us. Not this one, it seemed. The next morning, from my office window I looked down into the large gardens which occupy the center of Queen Square. Over the canopy, I could just glimpse the slate-gray statue of Queen Charlotte. There she stood, slightly awkward, her right hand outstretched but empty, clutching at the air. It had once held a mace, but revelers had extricated it a long time ago, in Victorian times. Because there was no original inscription, the statue had been considered to be a likeness of Queen Anne and, as a result, the square had been named in her honor. Much later, closer scrutiny suggested that Anne was very unlikely to be the monarch who had inspired this figure. Instead, the statue was of Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who, at the age of 17, had traveled from a small northern German duchy to marry the young king, George III. When she arrived in London, Charlotte apparently spoke no English. She was considered ugly by the court, deemed to have very little going for her. Indeed, some claimed that her facial features were far too foreign, reflecting a Moorish line of ancestry that can be traced back to a branch of the Portuguese royal family. Whatever the truth, Charlotte found it extremely difficult to connect with the English, but she seems to have been determined to try. She learned her new language rapidly and excelled at it, but she never lost her German accent. Her voice proved to be her ultimate weakness and, apparently, she never did really feel like she belonged. I could relate to that. When I'd arrived in the United Kingdom in 1968 as a child, I recall feeling extremely proud that I spoke English well, having been taught it from a very early age in what was then East Pakistan. Much later, at the age of 10, after I had excitedly recorded my own voice on my father's new Philips reel-to-reel tape recorder, I listened with shock to speech that I didn't recognize. It was delivered with a cadence that seemed almost alien to me. I surmised with some astonishment, a foreign accent. No matter how distinguished I considered my English to be, I was clearly deluded. This accent, together with the small matter of my brown skin, was what marked me out as being different. I resolved that I had to change, otherwise I would keep sounding like a foreigner. For the next 3 years, I listened diligently to BBC Radio, practicing my pronunciation and religiously recording my own voice to monitor if my accent was improving. Like Charlotte, I wanted to fit in. Years after her arrival, when King George suffered his first bout of madness, attributed by some to the metabolic illness known as porphyria. 2 by others to arsenic or bipolar disease. 3 he was tended to by Francis Willis, a physician whose house was apparently in Queen Square. Willis's techniques were part bullying and intimidation, part ingratiation. He had the king restrained, sometimes in a straitjacket, sometimes gagged. 4 the queen, distraught but keen to tend to her husband, supposedly found another house in the square where she kept provisions for him. Nowadays, this is the location of a pub, appropriately called the Queen's Larder and frequented by many neurologists. Eventually, George III's condition improved, probably due to natural recovery, but Willis took the credit and was lauded for his achievements. Although the king was to suffer further episodes, the link between brain disorder and Queen Square had been initiated. One certainly cannot escape history there. It pervades the place, cloaking its modern neurological occupants with their own peculiar culture of belonging, in this case to a long and rich tradition, to a legacy that is hard to ignore. David did eventually turn up that morning. It was a surprise to me. I was giving up hope when he arrived 40 minutes late. Trouble with the buses apparently. I didn't quite believe him, but I put that aside. He wasn't what I had imagined. In front of me sat a short, wiry man with a narrow face, framed by thick, black-rimmed spectacles through which he peered with deep disinterest. Dark brown, greasy hair slid over a sweaty forehead, and A ragged mustache, flecked with crumbs of cereal, perhaps from breakfast that morning, sat uncomfortably over his thin lips. A thicket of hair, surprisingly curly and rusty in color, covered his cheeks and chin, more coarse shrubbery than a beard. He sported a crumpled gray shirt that looked like it had clung to him for several days, and possibly nights, carrying food stains of a multitude of vintages. David looked so much older than his years. It seemed that he wasn't looking after himself. "Thanks for coming along," I said, wide-eyed and probably giving away too much of my concern about the state he was in. "Sure, yeah. I understand you were in hospital earlier this year. What are your biggest problems now?" "Problems? I don't have any problems." He shrugged. That movement of the shoulders made me smile. I had imagined exactly such a response when I'd spoken to him over the phone. David's face, by contrast, was far less expressive, but he looked as if he was unimpressed with my opening gambit. In fact, he seemed extremely unimpressed with me generally. "Well, your doctor wrote to ask me to see you." "Did he?" He pushed his heavy spectacles up the bridge of his nose. "How are you after the stroke?" "Fine. I got better pretty quickly." "So I understand. You don't have any weakness of your arms or legs?" "No." "You don't find anything more difficult?" "No." "What about your job?" "What about it?" I was clearly not getting very far. Each of my questions was resolutely being batted back with a straight face. David was going to be hard work. "How did you find it when you got back to your job?" I asked, trying to give him room to expand. "Fine," he said, not giving me an inch with his riposte. "Did your employers think the same?" This was now very direct from me, but I got the distinct feeling that I was going to have to be direct with David. He wasn't going to tell me anything useful of his own accord. "What do you mean?" he asked coyly, his eyes narrowing in apparent bemusement. "Are you still working?" I asked very slowly and deliberately. Now, the lips tightened, but only for a moment, before we were back to his expressionless face. "No, I'm not." I gave him time to say more, but there was no more. It was like talking to a brusque teenager. This was fast becoming a very staccato conversation. "Why's that?" "Things weren't working out," he responded vaguely. "Not working out?" "Yeah, not working out." To extract information from a complete stranger is an art that doctors have to learn. Neurologists, in particular, pride themselves on their ability to draw out the details so that a diagnosis becomes clear even before they've examined a patient. In medical school, students are taught to use open-ended questions, but most experienced doctors work out that they have to direct the questions depending on the quality of the responses from the patient. David, however, was exposing just how difficult the process can sometimes be, and I could feel myself getting frustrated by his diffidence. But I wondered if his brevity in response might in fact be part of his condition. So I tried a softer, less direct line. "Look, I'm only trying to find out what's happened to you." I said no more and allowed a sepulchral silence to fill the room. Outside, a truck rumbled by, the noise amplified by the lack of words between us. "They fired me," he said eventually. His unkempt mustache quivered a little. Again, I decided to hold back to see if he would say more. But he didn't. It was almost as if he needed to be prompted to give the next bit of information. "What did you do?" I asked very deliberately. "Nothing. That's the point. I couldn't be bothered to do anything. So they fired me. They sacked me just like that." "That sounds terrible," I responded, trying to be sympathetic. "You said that you couldn't be bothered. You mean when you went back to work after the stroke?" "That's right. I didn't care. I guess it showed." David was quite clear that he hadn't been feeling low or depressed. He just couldn't be bothered. No, he wasn't worried about the future, and he definitely hadn't thought about getting a new job. He shrugged his shoulders. We were going down the wrong channels. Again, I wondered whether it might be me. Was my irritation showing? Or perhaps this really was part of David's condition. The reason why his friends were becoming frustrated with him too. How is it, living with your friends? I asked, trying to change the subject once more. Apparently, it was fantastic. They'd been really great to him and were real mates. He could count on them, but surprisingly he didn't seem either genuinely enthusiastic or grateful for what they'd done. He'd been with them for 4 months, and he was quite honest in saying that he had moved in with his friends because he could no longer afford to pay the rent on his own flat. But when I asked him whether unemployment benefit would have covered this, he responded eventually by saying he couldn't be bothered with the hassle of filling in all those forms. No, he hadn't gone to an employment center either because, as he put it, he couldn't be arsed. What's going to happen then? How do you mean? He asked indifferently. Well, your friends seem really kind. But how long can you stay with them for? Oh, for as long as I like, I think. They haven't said anything about how long I can stay. They're all right with having me about, he added with a grin. I decided to move on and asked him what he was doing during the day. Apparently, he spent much of the time sitting on his own, doing nothing. Previously, he would have listened to music or read novels, he explained. Any reason why you're not doing any of those things now? I asked. Well, I'd like to listen to music, but I'd have to put my music system together, and I just haven't taken the trouble to do that. Oh, how long would it take to put your hi-fi system together? Then, another pause, but I allowed it to come between us. David looked bemused again. 5 minutes. I'd have to unpack it, stick the leads into the speakers, plug it in, but I can't be bothered. This was revelatory. David had lost his job but wasn't apparently unhappy. He didn't seem to think his situation was hopeless despite the fact that he wasn't making any attempt to find a new job. He was living with friends, actually, living off them, and, as I found out later when I spoke to them by telephone, in his own way he'd become a bit of a stranger to them. Disheveled, no longer caring about his appearance, not even bothering to have a shower unless they prompted him. The man who had been at the center of his social circle, the insider, had been transformed into someone who was quite alien to them. Yet, despite all this, he was quite remarkably indifferent to his new circumstances. He had developed pathological apathy. All of a sudden, as David left the consulting room, I wondered if I would ever see him again. My mantra to medical students is that, whatever we do, as doctors, we should always try to make a patient feel better leaving the clinic than when they came to see us. This means connecting with the person as an individual, but in this case I didn't feel like that had happened. At best, David had been indifferent about the consultation. At worst, from his point of view, he hadn't really got anything out of it. But had I? Why couldn't David be motivated to do anything? Why wasn't he bothered? In 19th century Russian literature, Ivan Goncharov, in his novel Oblomov, created a seemingly similar character. Oblomov is a young landowner who inherits an estate but is completely incapable of taking any action or decision. For long, languorous stretches of the novel he lies in his bed, moving only occasionally to sit on his chair. He is the paradigm of inertia. David was, in many ways, a mirror image of Oblomov. He was apathetic, indifferent, and seemingly not motivated to do anything. But there was one Important difference. David had changed character suddenly after his unusual strokes, whereas apathy was a lifelong trait in Oblomov. So why didn't David do anything? He certainly wasn't depressed. So that wasn't the reason. The more I thought about it, the more shocking his inactive predicament seemed to me. Could it be that the location of his brain damage was telling me something important about normal motivation in all of us? Had his strokes extinguished his motivation because they had effectively taken out some of the circuitry that normally makes healthy people motivated? Had David become apathetic because these regions weren't working properly? I needed to find out more. David's strokes had affected the basal ganglia. These nuclei lie deep in the brain. Fig. 1. They are ancient structures, present throughout the vertebrates, backboned animals, all the way back to the humble lamprey, a species of jawless fish which emerged 360 million years ago and still survives to this day. But, although the basal ganglia have a long ancestry in evolution, as Kinnear Wilson, one of Queen Square's famous neurologists, put it in his lectures to the Royal College of Physicians in 1925, they are like the dark basement of the brain. 5 At the time of Wilson's lectures, people certainly understood very little about the functions of the basal ganglia. We now know far more, but still have a long way to go to figure out all that goes on down in the basement. Fig. 1. The basal ganglia. These structures, shaded gray, are located deep in the brain, as shown in this section through the brain. In David, small parts of the basal ganglia had been affected by his strokes on both sides of the brain. The image of the brain on the right shows the level at which this section is taken. Although they lie deep from the surface of the brain, the basal ganglia are highly connected to the overlying cerebral cortex. Different areas of the cortex send connections to different parts of the basal ganglia, which in turn send projections back to the cortical regions, including areas in the frontal lobe involved in the control of movement. 6, 7, 8 These massive loops of connections between the basal ganglia and the frontal cortex have been found to be critical for many functions, including the initiation and invigoration of movement. 9, 10, 11 Indeed, for many decades the basal ganglia have been associated with the control of actions, largely because of clinical observations of abnormal movements resulting from their damage, such as those that occur in Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, or even the rare illness named after Kinnear Wilson himself, Wilson's disease. In all these conditions, there are profound changes in movement. In Parkinson's, there might be a slowing of action, or a tremor or rigidity. In Huntington's, there can be unwanted, sudden thrusts of the head or flinging of limbs, and in Wilson's, there might be strange, awkward posturing of the limbs termed dystonia. But although early work on the basal ganglia focused on their role in the control of movement, and how this goes awry in brain diseases, it has since become clear that they do far more. Most of our modern insights into the functions of the basal ganglia have come not from studies of human diseases, but rather from fundamental neuroscience. Particularly interesting is the work of Canadian physiologist Gordon Mogensen. Neither animals nor humans make movements without good reason, he argued. 12 There needs to be a motivation for action. Mogensen proposed that animals move to satisfy internal, primary motives: the need for food, water, to get warmer or cooler, and for sex. This is necessary to survive and to secure the species. For Mogensen, the basal ganglia are a crucial bridge between motivation and the initiation of action. Think for a moment about the sensation of hunger. We experience it several times a day. But what is it? It's an urge to find food in order to quell the sensation we call hunger. But why does that sensation arise just a few hours after our last meal? Most of us are not going to starve if we don't have food every few hours. Yet the drive to seek calories arises irresistibly in our minds, producing a compelling urge to leave what we're doing and focus instead on finding food. Hunger is an irresistible motivator that we all succumb to. Mogensen considered two parts of the basal ganglia to play a key role in effectively converting motivation to action. One of these, known as the nucleus accumbens, was intact in David, but the other, critical area known as the ventral pallidum had been damaged by his strokes. A large number of investigations in animals, mostly rodents, has now revealed that both these regions are necessary for motivated behavior. 13. When the nucleus accumbens or the ventral pallidum become dysfunctional, rats become less motivated to make an effort, whereas normally they might be prepared to work hard to obtain food that they really like. When these areas of the basal ganglia are disrupted, the animals appear quite indifferent. They become disinterested in putting an effort to acquire rewarding outcomes such as food that they previously prized highly. The more I dived into these studies, the more I began to see similarities to what had happened to David. He really couldn't be bothered to put in effort to receive rewarding outcomes, like getting paid for doing his job or putting his music system together to listen to his favorite tracks. How could we find out whether he was sensitive to rewards? I had an idea. We had finally got David into the research center at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience located opposite the hospital in Queen Square. He'd missed 2 of his previous appointments. To ensure he made it, we had to resort to booking a taxi to pick him up. He arrived even more disheveled than before. His clothes looked like they hadn't been washed for weeks, and the same might also have been true for David himself. The mustache and beard were now overgrown, a thicket of ragged curls and twisting russet tendrils. His fingernails were enormously long, some splintered, all discolored by streaks of dirt underneath them. Things were obviously getting worse. I'm really sorry for not getting here earlier. I just found it difficult to get my act together, he said, wiping his spectacles with a dirty handkerchief. Don't worry, I responded. Thanks for agreeing to take part in this research. How have you been? David looked rather sheepishly to the floor, his thick-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down his nose. Oh, fine, thanks, he responded. Are you sure? I asked gently. David hesitated, his face still not giving away his emotions. Then he said, I've actually been having a bit of trouble with my mates, if you must know. There was another long pause before he explained that his friends had been getting annoyed with him. He cleaned or did the shopping, but only when they asked him. Nothing happened without them prompting him. Now they were giving up, even asking him to do things. He realized his shortcomings, but he just couldn't be bothered if they didn't remind him. He never really thought about doing anything, he explained, let alone helping with the domestic chores. David was telling us something interesting. He needed to be nudged to achieve everyday tasks. He lacked the ability to motivate himself to do these things. He didn't have motivation to act. As Mogensen might say, is it all right between you and your friends otherwise? Are you getting on with them? I asked. Not really. They don't talk to me much. I get the feeling they avoid me. They don't eat with me anymore. Sometimes I don't feel like I really belong there, but I'm sure it'll be all right if I do a bit more around the house, he said, convincing neither of us. David was becoming alienated from his friends who, not so long ago, had considered him as one of their own. His reluctance to do anything without prompting had frustrated the very people who really liked him. Within a few months, it had led to them not engaging with him, just as he was not connecting with them. It was that easy to fall from the comfort of belonging to the in-group, as social psychologists would put it, to losing a sense of belonging in becoming part of the out-group. Motivation to behave in the way that is expected of a group member is a key part of belonging. We have expectations about how engaged our friends, family members, and colleagues should be with us, and they also have presumptions about how motivated we should be towards keeping connections with them. They have expectations about the contributions we make to the group. The level of commitment required to keep our membership differs across different types of social networks. It depends partly on the elasticity of tolerance other members are willing to stretch to, as well as the longevity of the group. Some communities can have remarkable patience with the unsociable behavior of their prodigal sons and daughters, who might be fortunate enough to enjoy the benefits of a strong relationship built over many years. The same degree of tolerance might not be afforded by people we've only just got to know. As a result, group memberships can lapse. Our social networks can collapse if we don't put in the effort to maintain relationships. Part of the quality of that endeavor is often judged by the yardstick of communal responsibility. Within a household, this might be measured by the willingness to keep the kitchen and bathroom clean, restock the fridge, cook for others in the house, make an effort in conversation, or even suggest social activities. David did none of these things. Then there's the issue of hygiene, the cleanliness of the clothes one wears, and the attention one pays to grooming. Demeanor matters. Again, David's evident self-neglect wasn't helping his cause. All these factors, often tallied up subconsciously but sometimes scored explicitly, provide a metric of motivation by which we are judged. Lack of commitment to contributing to the overall good of the group, in any way, is soon noticed and, as some of us have undoubtedly experienced, there are consequences. Robin Dunbar, an Oxford anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist, and his colleagues observe that free riders, those who take the benefits from being in a community but do not contribute, challenge the mutual trust within a group. 15 According to them, social groups originally evolved because of the many benefits obtained from being together, including mutual protection, hunting, and the ability to share food and knowledge. But belonging entails signing up to unwritten social contracts, which involve trusting other members of the group and honoring social obligations that are embedded in a community. A key aspect of this is a willingness to make an effort or contribute without necessarily expecting an immediate return on that investment. David wasn't doing any of that of his own volition. Failure to meet the social expectations of motivated behavior tests the forbearance of people within a social group. Nevertheless, it is still possible to be allowed to remain within it if our behavior reverts to what is expected, the norms for that group. But for many individuals with a brain disorder, that is often not possible. Under such circumstances, a group member can effectively be ostracized. There is a cost attached to group affiliation. As David was finding out, I took him to the testing room. First, we performed some screening cognitive tests, assessing his perception, attention, memory, language, visual spatial skills, and aspects of frontal lobe function. David passed all of these without any difficulty. Next, we moved on to the main reason I had brought him back to see us. Around that time, in my research group, we had developed a new test to detect impulsive, risky decision-making for rewards. It had proved to be very useful in measuring how willing people were to take risks if the reward was sufficiently attractive for them. Although we hadn't thought of it before, I now wondered whether we might Also use this new task to investigate the converse. Could it reveal when someone was not incentivized by the prospect of rewards? I sat David in front of a computer screen. So, what do I do? Do you see the traffic light on the left-hand side of the screen? I asked, pointing to it. Sure, he said. In this test, I want you to look at the traffic light. Now it's red, but it will turn amber, then green. When it goes green, you have to move your eyes as quickly as possible to look at the white square on the other side of the screen. Okay, sounds simple. David nodded. The quicker you move your eyes to the square, the bigger the reward you win. And we measure where you're looking using this fancy camera, I said, pointing to a bit of expensive kit that allows us to measure where the eyes are looking. So, the faster I react, the more I win? What exactly do I win? He asked inquisitively. At least I had piqued his interest, I thought. Well, in this test it's actually money. You see, the faster you go, the bigger the reward in terms of the money you make. The computer tells you how much you make on each trial. Sounds easy. Well, there are a few things you need to know about this game. David, if you make an eye movement before the traffic light turns green, there's a penalty. You lose a small amount of money. On the other hand, if you go late after the amber turns to green, you make very little money. So, it's more challenging than you think. Okay, I'll give it a go, he said. Most people find it fun to do this test. It's a game for them and they're keen to accumulate as much money as possible. But it's actually more challenging than they initially think. To win a big reward, they soon find out that they have to anticipate when the amber light will turn green. However, to make life difficult, the exact duration of the amber light isn't constant, but varies from trial to trial. So, it is never possible to predict with absolute certainty when it will turn green. On the other hand, if people just wait for the green light, they end up winning very little. To do well on this test, to earn the most amount of money, you have to take some risk. Ideally, your eyes should start moving exactly as the traffic light turns green. However, because it takes 200 milliseconds, a fifth of a second, from wishing to start the movement to the eyes actually moving, you have to make the decision to shift your eyes while the traffic light is still amber. And because you never know exactly how long the amber light lasts, you have to take a risk about whether to initiate the eye movement while it is still on. If you take the risk, of course, on some occasions, you'll go before amber turns green and incur the small flat, fixed penalty. However, on other occasions you'll hit it right. Your eyes will start moving just as the traffic light goes green. Then, you can make a lot of money because your eyes can shift to the box on the other side of the screen before the reward level falls very much. In short, if people are incentivized to obtain a high reward, they start to take risks and plan to make their eye movement during the amber light, not wait until the light turns green. Individuals vary in their willingness to take such risks, but everybody does to some extent, particularly when the amber light duration is long. David, however, was completely different in how he approached the task. He could understand it and perform it, but he would just wait until the traffic light turned green before he made his eye movement. He never anticipated, he never initiated movements before the green light came on. 0.16 as a result. Compared to other people of his age, he made almost nothing in terms of the total reward earned. Unsurprisingly, he was indifferent. Yeah, that was interesting, he said, clearly not at all curious or perturbed that he'd done so badly. He sat with his arms folded, waiting. It had been very instructive for us to observe how he performed this task. It showed us that David was capable of taking actions when prompted by an external signal, by the traffic light turning green, but he would not initiate those actions himself in order to maximize his rewards. The results of several other assessments we made also led us to conclude that an important feature of David's apathy was that he was not incentivized, of his own volition, to obtain rewards. He had possessed very little sensitivity to reward. He couldn't be bothered to initiate actions himself, because the outcomes didn't matter to him. Instead, he just waited until prompted to make the action by the green light coming on. This was analogous to what happened to David in real life. He'd do nothing, or very little, of his own volition, but he was quite happy to clean up, go shopping, or even cook if he was asked to do so by his now increasingly frustrated housemates. Given that on the traffic light test he seemed to be insensitive to rewards that would normally motivate most of us, I began to wonder whether there might be a way in which we could attempt to restore reward sensitivity in David. The brain chemical dopamine has had a long association with pleasure and reward. In fact, many research studies in the 1960s and 70s began to lead to the hypothesis that dopamine is the brain's pleasure chemical. Our views about what dopamine does have changed quite a lot since then. Most researchers now believe that dopamine acts as a key chemical to motivate us to seek rewards. 17. Rather than giving rise to pleasure directly, it promotes us to be motivated to search for pleasure or reward. Perhaps most relevant for David is the fact that dopamine is also a key brain chemical for the basal ganglia. When parts of the basal ganglia are depleted of dopamine, people develop the motor features of Parkinson's disease, a condition that was untreatable until researchers found a way to boost the level of dopamine in the brain. Some of those early studies are beautifully recorded by Oliver Sacks in his book Awakenings. 18. Neurologists such as Sacks used the precursor of dopamine, levodopa, combined with a drug that would prevent its breakdown in the blood if it was taken by mouth. This combination can have astonishingly positive effects on improving movement in people with features of Parkinson's disease, seemingly awakening them by increasing the amount of dopamine produced in the brain. But could such a drug be of any use for someone like David? He didn't have a problem with moving. His difficulty was in motivating himself to move, to act, to do anything. He didn't seem to initiate any actions unless he was prompted to do so. Work in animals suggested that it might be worth trying levodopa. Researchers have found that when rats have low levels of dopamine, even if they are able to make movements, they seem less motivated to invest physical effort for rewards. 13. I discussed this with David. He was, as ever, indifferent. Initially, there was the inevitable shrug of the shoulders, but eventually he decided to try it. "All right, I'll give it a go if you think it might help," he said, showing not a flicker of excitement at the prospect that there might be some way to improve his current state. "I can't guarantee it will, David, but I think it's worth seeing how you do on this medicine." As he walked off with his box of tablets in his hand, I couldn't help but wonder whether he would even be bothered to take the drugs. Slowly, over several weeks, we increased the dose of levodopa that David took, making sure, as best we could through phone call prompts, that he was actually taking the medication. 3 months later, although he said he felt better, he seemed unchanged. Furthermore, when we asked him to perform the traffic light test again, there was barely any difference. He remained just as insensitive to potential rewards as he had been before, simply waiting until the traffic light turned green before he moved his eyes. "Yeah, that was good," he said when he completed the test. "But, clearly, Levodopa hadn't had any noticeable impact on his apathy or his sensitivity to rewards. This was very disappointing. So, we decided to take him off the medication slowly, before we gave up on this approach completely. However, one other thought occurred to me. Many Parkinson's disease patients are now treated not only with levodopa but also with drugs that mimic dopamine by locking on to specific receptors on the nerve cells that bind dopamine. These dopamine receptor agonists, often simply referred to as dopamine agonists, can be highly effective in treating the movement impairments of Parkinson's disease. Over the last few years, however, we have begun to realize that sometimes, at higher doses, dopamine agonists can tip some patients into making impulsive, rash decisions such as gambling too much money, going on shopping sprees for things they don't need, or becoming hypersexual. In short, on these drugs, some people can become too highly incentivized to seek rewarding outcomes. One of our patients, for example, managed to spend over £10 on online betting in a day. When the dose of dopamine agonist is reduced, these behaviors can resolve, so they appear to be directly induced by activation of dopamine receptors within the brain. Similar impulsivity occurs far less often with levodopa, perhaps because levodopa increases dopamine produced by nerve cells in the brain in a general manner, whereas dopamine agonists directly stimulate specific dopamine receptors on neurons. Some of these receptors might be particularly important for initiating actions. If dopamine agonists can also turn Parkinson's patients towards becoming impulsive and taking risks, might they be effective in treating David's apathy by making him more sensitive to rewards, and thereby energize him to initiate actions? I put this idea to him, and again, although nonplussed, he decided that he'd like to give it a try. Sure, if you think this'll be any better than the last lot of pills, he said cautiously. We started him on a dopamine agonist called ropinirole. Neurologists have extensive experience of using this drug in patients with Parkinson's disease, but we had no idea what it would do for David and his lack of motivation. Very slowly, we increased the dose of ropinirole, again calling him regularly to check that he was taking the medication, and that he wasn't experiencing any side effects such as the impulsive behavior that can occur in some Parkinson's patients on dopamine agonists. 3 months after starting the treatment, we managed to persuade him to see us again in person to check on how he was doing. The receptionist at our research center called me to say that David had arrived. When I went down to meet him and looked around the waiting room, I couldn't see him. There was only some guy in a smart suit and a young woman there. I thought you said David was here? I asked the receptionist. He is. That's him over there, she replied, nodding her head in the direction of the man in the corner. I turned my gaze towards him. As I took a closer look, it was clear that the receptionist was right. This was in fact David, but barely recognizable. The greasy hair, which had previously covered much of his forehead, had been elaborately cut and combed back to a quiff. The mustache, normally lined with crumbs, and the untended hedgerow of a beard had been dispatched. In its stead, a clean, shaven visage proudly basked in the daylight. I peered at David in disbelief. He looked so young. His outfit was shocking to me, too. A crisply ironed white shirt, adorned with an understated lavender tie, lay under an immaculate navy blue suit, sporting a pair of polished brogues. David sat one leg crossed over the other, a leather briefcase by his side. As he rose to greet me, a flash of silver cuff links capped off his startling new look. "Hello," he exclaimed. It was my turn to be slow in responding. "You well, doctor?" You look a bit pale if you don't mind me saying. So, he said cheekily, smiling. I'm fine, quite fine, I said. Tell me what's been happening to you since we last met. I'm different, he explained, spreading his arms wide open. You certainly are, I observed after another pause. Very different. I looked at him closely again, taking in more details of the new David. His fingernails had been neatly trimmed. No dirt under those, I thought, and no food stains anywhere either. Sure you're okay? He asked again, smiling broadly. Yes, I'm quite sure, thanks. Oh good. You'll be pleased to know I got myself a job. Doctor. A job? How did you do that? I blurted out. Well, I answered an advertisement in the papers. Simple as that. Of course, I had to get my CV together. Spruce up a bit, look the part. He laughed, pointing at his suit. What kind of job is it? It's in a financial services firm, like the one I was in before. And it's working out really well. The pay's good, so I left my friend's place and rented a flat. The last few weeks have been fantastic. Really? I said slowly. Yeah, and guess what, doctor? I've even met someone. She's brilliant. We've been going out for the last month. I'm really happy. David was beaming. I had not seen so much expression in his face in any of our previous discussions. This also felt like the first natural conversation between us. He was even volunteering information spontaneously, without me having to drag it out of him. I considered what he had said about his new job and flat, but the news that David had a girlfriend, when he'd previously barely gone out and had been so disheveled, was, to say the least, perhaps the most shocking of his revelations that afternoon. His life seemed to have been transformed. Of course, it could have been pure chance, but that hardly seemed likely given how long he'd been apathetic. We got him to do the traffic light test again, and this time he behaved differently. 16 Like normal people, he started to take risks. He started to anticipate and initiate eye movements before the traffic lights turned green. The amount he won increased substantially compared to his previous attempts on this test. So, it appeared that ropinirole, the drug that clung to and directly activated dopamine receptors in the brain, had made a huge difference. It had incentivized him to seek rewards on our test, and, far more importantly, in his life too. David was now a seemingly highly motivated individual. This is amazing. It's great to see you doing so well, I said, still not quite believing the change in him. Thanks, Doc. It's a little miracle. You might well be right, David. I nodded. Can't hang around, though, as I'll be late for drinks with my old housemates. Things are a lot better on that front too, by the way. Before I moved to my new flat, they were really impressed that I was doing more of the cleaning, preparing a meal before they got back home. Probably also that I was looking a lot tidier myself. Really? Yeah, really. Those pills might have done the trick. But I've got to go. See you soon, and thanks for everything. And off he went. He never would have worried or bothered about being late, let alone turning up to meetings with people before. Now, he was in a rush. I was quietly elated. This was a day to celebrate a very unusual achievement. Had we really found a cure for apathy? David proved to be a turning point in my life and research. He was living proof that it was possible to turn someone who had suddenly developed pathological inertia back into being a highly motivated individual, capable of leading an independent and rewarding life. Motivation is a key attribute of human brains and of being human. It's a brain function we usually take for granted, but it shapes our identities. We have all come across people who seem highly motivated at school, in a sports team, at college, in the workplace. who often also seemed to be highly successful. Meeting David made me aware of how easy it is for someone who is at the center of his social group suddenly to become an outsider and to lose their sense of belonging, even to close friends, simply because of a change in their level of motivation. David was, of course, an extremely rare person. Strokes like his, which selectively disrupt the ventral pallidum of the basal ganglia, are extremely rare, but it turns out that apathy is an extremely common syndrome that occurs in many other brain disorders such as Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia and Parkinson's disease, which we now know can have manifestations that are not just motor. 19 Roughly a third of patients with these diseases develop pathological apathy. These conditions are all neurodegenerative disorders where parts of the brain slowly begin to shrink, losing nerve cells over time. Until recently, we didn't really have a good idea about why such diverse diseases might lead to the same syndrome of apathy. The insights we gained from seeing and testing David in our research provided an important answer. Although his apathy was due to 2 tiny strokes, these happened to be very strategically located. Despite being extremely small, they had rendered dysfunctional a key brain circuit that connects the basal ganglia to frontal regions of the brain, and in so doing they had disrupted what Gordon Mogensen had termed motivation to action, how goals that are highly rewarding trigger actions which allow us to attain them. 12 It turns out that the same circuitry is also disrupted in neurodegenerative conditions that can be associated with apathy. Using brain scanning, we were able to reveal that the circuit that was dysfunctional in David is also disrupted in apathetic people who have vascular dementia. 20 Whether this same circuit has implications for understanding the milder forms of apathy that occur in healthy individuals is an intriguing question. Until I met David, I had thought that there are some people who are highly motivated and others who are simply lazy. David's strokes revealed that there might be a biological mechanism that could be crucial to how motivated a person might be. When part of this circuit is taken out, motivation can be extinguished. David made me wonder whether we might be able to detect differences in brain activity between highly motivated people and apathetic people who are otherwise healthy. Remarkably, we found that there are indeed such variations located in the basal ganglia and the frontal cortex. When healthy volunteers were asked to decide whether making an action is worth the effort to obtain a reward. 21 Of course, there might be many reasons why some people lack motivation, not simply because they're not incentivized by rewarding outcomes, but perhaps because they have become depressed. But our brain scan findings in healthy individuals suggest that some of the differences in motivation we observe in people might be explained specifically by alterations in the brain circuit related to motivation, not mood. There might, therefore, be a biological mechanism that accounts for some of the variability in levels of motivation we encounter across our friends, family members, and colleagues. In David's case, motivation was extinguished suddenly because strokes occur abruptly. However, in neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's or vascular dementia, it can happen very slowly, creeping up on both patients and their families over many years. In my clinic, I see many wives or husbands of patients with such neurodegenerative diseases who say that they understand why their partner can't remember information, but what really irritates them is that their spouse will no longer help with the washing up or take the bins out, just as David's friends complained about his everyday apathy. I explained that this lack of motivation is part of the disease. It's not the patient's fault and, most importantly, they are not willfully being inactive. It's just that their brains no longer have the ability to generate motivation, and they might have very little insight about the fact that they're so inert. This can seem perplexing at first, but once people appreciate that the apathy is caused by the disease affecting parts of the brain that normally motivate us to action, they are more willing to be tolerant. Of course, what they still long for is their partner to return to their previous selves. We found that David's pathological apathy was due to the fact that he had lost sensitivity to rewards. He didn't do anything because he didn't find any particular behavior to be very rewarding, so there was no motivation to act. Dopamine turned out to be a key chemical that ramped up his sensitivity to rewards and restored his motivation to take action. Exciting new work in neurodegenerative conditions such as Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease has begun to show that drugs that increase dopamine levels can help treat apathy in people with these conditions. 2.22 However, dopamine is unlikely to be the only chemical in the brain that affects motivation. We're just at the beginning of understanding apathy in neurological diseases, with several research teams around the world making rapid progress in this field. But my personal foray into apathy all started with meeting David. What people like him have shown us is how essential motivation is in constructing our personal and social identities, who we are and how others perceive and evaluate us. 2. The man who ran out of words. This has been cool, not like any other medical clinic I've been to, she said in her strong South London accent. I'm glad you found it interesting. But how come there are all these conditions I haven't even read about in our textbooks? She asked curiously. Well, I guess it depends upon the textbook you read. Anyway, I thought you all get your information from the internet nowadays. Do medical students still read books? I asked, smiling at Amina. I had met her once before on one of our teaching rounds, and she had struck me then as someone who wasn't shy of speaking her mind. In fact, quite the opposite. I believe the modern term for someone like her is an oversharer. It was Amina's turn to sit in on my clinic as she went through her 4-week neurology rotation. Some of us do still read books, she said with a smirk, raising her eyebrows, but only if we get advice on which books are worth reading. So, what should I read? She asked, spreading her delicate, dark hands wide apart for emphasis. I nodded, impressed by her enthusiasm. It had been a long afternoon. Now it was 20 to 6 and my last patient still had not arrived. 2 extras had been overbooked earlier into the clinic because they needed to be seen relatively urgently. We had been able to deal with them quite quickly. But I had also been teaching Amina, which, although fun, had also proved to be rather discursive. Without prompting, Amina had explained that her family had escaped from Somalia when she was a young child. They had been refugees from the Civil War and had survived a very difficult journey to the UK. She didn't really remember anything about Somalia. She had never been back. All she really knew was London. But it had been a real struggle growing up here when she was young. I probably didn't have any real idea of what it was like, she assumed. And I didn't correct her. But it had been hard to fit in. Very hard. But she had been so pleased to get a place at the medical school a few years ago. She was loving it. It had been a liberating experience, one that freed her from the cultural expectations of women in her family while exposing her to all this wonderful learning. Well, if there's one book you might look at, it's this one, I said as I scribbled down the details on a post-it note. You'll find it in the library. I was finishing my sentence when she interrupted me. And before you say it, yes, I do know where the library is, she responded, in a half-mocking tone, smiling broadly. I would never have thought otherwise. Amina Our last patient hasn't arrived, so I think we're done for today. It was good to have you sitting in on the clinic and asking so many questions. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time with us in neurology. I started to gather my notes together, but before Amina could respond, there was a knock at the door. I'm very sorry, doctor, but your 5 o'clock has just turned up. His train had been held at a stop signal and he's only now got here, explained our clinic nurse. Okay, that's a shame he's so late, but I can see him, I said with an air of resignation. The trouble is we have to lock up at 6. Those are the rules. There isn't enough nursing cover after then. Shall we make another appointment for him? As I considered the options, a very elegantly dressed man appeared at the nurse's shoulder, the sapphire flash of his eyes turning to gaze at us intently. I'm terribly sorry, doctor, but I couldn't help overhearing the conversation. Michael Buckley's the name, and if you can give me even 20 minutes of your time, I would be so grateful. I do understand that I'm late, but it was out of my control. I'm afraid. He was striking, verging on the flamboyant, but somehow self-aware enough not to appear contrived. His shock of silver hair was impressively swept back, with the straightest of side partings dividing it with precision. Immaculately dressed, with a spotted burgundy handkerchief in the top pocket of his green tweed jacket, and a navy blue tie knotted in an extravagant Windsor. Michael Buckley was nothing if not majestic, but it was when he spoke that the drama became extraordinary. Out of his mouth came a delicious, sonorous voice that gripped the listener. It was authoritative, yet generous, calm but full of excitement, passionate and at the same time quite gentle. The entire presentation seemed paradoxical yet polished to a high luster. He made his mark. Do come in, Mr. Buckley, but I'm afraid it can't be for long. As you heard, this is Amina, one of our students. I hope you don't mind her being with us? Not at all. Thank you so much, he said with a nod of appreciation. What exactly is the problem? I asked. Despite his outward demeanor, things were apparently not perfect for Michael, for this singularly impressive man, now in his late 60s, had come to seek help. He was encountering difficulties. And, of all things, given his bearing and gravitas, he was worried about his speech. I'm having trouble finding the right words. I can be midway through a sentence and then groping for the correct word. If you see what I mean, it's so frustrating and, perhaps more to the point, it's bloody embarrassing. You see, doctor, I pride myself on my ability to speak to the point, be sharp in my responses. Now all of that is fading away. I feel like I'm losing my faculties. It bothers me a lot. He said all this without hesitation but with a clear, genuine fear. If there was a problem with his speech, though, it wasn't easy to detect on first listening. I see. How long have you noticed there's been a problem? I asked, wanting to hear more. I suppose it must be for at least a year. It's getting worse. Would anyone notice? Well, I notice. Michael's voice rose indignantly. Nobody has mentioned anything, but I suspect people who know me notice. It's made me lose confidence. You see, I tend not to pursue a line of argument and just drop it instead. I'd never do that in the past. I still couldn't detect any errors in his speech. It seemed flawless. I could see by Amina's face that she thought the same too. Tell me a little about yourself, I asked, hoping to hear an example in his speech of what he was worried about. What did you do for a living? I worked in the city, investments. I miss it sometimes, but to be honest, I'm glad to be free of that life. It wore me down. Now I potter around the garden, take care of the grandchildren, enjoy watching the cricket or rugby. His hands interlocked with steepled fingers. Michael went on to tell me how, while he'd been very successful at his job, he thought he hadn't achieved anything very meaningful in life, how his biggest regret was declining an offer to do a PhD in history and how he missed being challenged. It was too late now, of course, but he still loved reading. Had I seen the latest book on the Glorious Revolution of 1688 when James II had been deposed by William of Orange and his Dutch fleet? It was clearly hogwash to suggest that this had been anything other than the most successful invasion of the British Isles. Somehow, history had subsequently been rewritten, distorted, to conform to a British narrative of not being conquered. He was compelling to listen to, and not once did he pause or stumble over his words. I began to think there wasn't going to be much substance to his concerns because he was, literally, so well spoken. But then we turned to the subject of sport. Yes, I used to play a lot of rugby. I got to county level. Still love watching it. He smiled. Which position did you play? He was quiet, seemingly puzzled and definitely taking far too long to answer a very straightforward question. Position? Michael asked quizzically, raising his shoulders and looking to Amina for help. Yes, position, I said. Were you in the scrum? Scrum? There was another long pause. What's a scrum? If you're unfamiliar with the game of rugby, a scrum might not mean much to you either. But ask a British schoolchild who has ever seen a game, even on the television, and they would understand what you meant. The scrum is a fundamental part of the game of rugby. It's a peculiarly bizarre means of restarting play. 8 men on each side put their heads down and push against each other, but only when the egg-shaped rugby ball is slipped in between them. 2. The outsider. It looks like a grotesque, primeval form of tribal warfare, but for a man who played rugby at a high level in his youth, not to know the meaning of scrum was very odd. It was a clue. You're not familiar with a scrum? I asked, just to make sure. No, I don't think so. What is it? A scrum is when two sets of players put their heads down, come together and then shove when the ball is put in between them. Oh, a scrum. Yes, of course. Michael flinched. So which position did you play? I asked again. Ah yes, I was a scrum half. I had my face rubbed in the pitch a lot. He laughed. I smiled too. I knew exactly what he meant. That sentence brought back a reel of memories for me. What flickered into my mind was the sight and then the smell of sodden mud, and my own face being rubbed in it. As a boy I had found myself in a very traditional English grammar school in Birmingham, an establishment which prided itself on its rugby prowess. Being a tall 11-year-old meant there was no escape from playing the game, particularly when our very enthusiastic and unrelenting Cumbrian rugby coach spotted you as a potential talent. My thoughts returned to Michael. Was this apparent aberration of not knowing what a scrum is a mere quirk? That seemed highly unlikely. I should pursue this more. Tell me, what do we call something we use to cut grass in the garden? I asked, my mind obviously still not too far away from soil. Well, a grass cutter I suppose, Michael said with a laugh. There's another name for it. Michael looked anxious. I'm not sure. Can't think of it. What about the thing I might use to sweep leaves up in the garden? He frowned and looked up at the ceiling as if there might be inspiration there. I don't know. He paused. This is precisely the kind of problem I might have, doctor, he said, and I could see the fear returning to his face. I see. I hope you won't mind me asking you a few other questions. This is the only way I get to find out exactly what your problem is. He nodded. Tell me, do you know what a lawnmower is? I asked. Michael snorted impatiently. Of course I know what a lawnmower I bought one for my youngest daughter the other day. She insisted she needed it, and I have to say I was a bit annoyed. It came out of the blue, and I don't know why she had to ask me of all people. She's old enough to buy a lawnmower herself, if you ask me. Michael was becoming a little agitated, but he still hadn't answered my question. So, what is a lawnmower for? I repeated. Well, a lawnmower is for what my daughter wants. Does your daughter have a garden? No, she lives on the second floor of a block of flats. So, why does she need a lawnmower? That's a silly question. Of course, everybody needs a lawnmower. She wants to hang it up on her wall. I see. Amina's eyes had become wide open. Frankly, I'm fed up of her asking for favors, he continued, raising his hands in apparent exasperation and turning pointedly to Amina, as if she were for some reason a representative of wayward daughters. An important skill that we try to teach medical students is not to be deflected from questions if you don't get an answer, unless of course it's distressing to the patient. It would have been easy for me to drop my rather persistent line of inquiry about grass cutting machines, but continuing with it had revealed something unexpected. Michael really didn't seem to know what a lawnmower was for or what it was. What about a rake? What would you use a rake for? A rake? Yes, a rake. Well, that's easy. You use it to, and then you're done. You use it to. I left the question hanging. Exactly. You use it and then you're done, he replied confidently. Can you draw a rake for me? I'm not good at drawing. Just a rough picture so I can see what you mean, I persisted. I gave him my ballpoint pen and he drew, with great skill and in some detail, a toothbrush. Thank you, I said. Amina, looking over my shoulder, opened her mouth in astonishment. A toothbrush is obviously not a rake, but in some ways, it is related. You don't use it to clear the garden of leaves, but it is a brushing implement. Was this another clue? There was a knock at the door. I'm really very sorry, doctor, but we've cleared all the other clinic rooms and have to shut the entrance now, explained the nurse. Mr. Buckley, I apologize that we can't continue today, but we can bring you back next week to complete the rest of the testing. And now I have some idea of your symptoms. He left, seemingly very grateful for having had the opportunity to see me even briefly. Wow, I would never have guessed that he would have any problems with his language at all. He seemed so sophisticated, so fluent, Amina commented. I agree, it really was difficult to spot any problems with his language initially, but do you see how persisting with carefully taking the history can pay off? Wasn't it interesting how, as we went on with the conversation, we began to find out what his difficulties are? Oh yeah, Amina smiled. Even I know what a scrum is. Tilde. Dusk was falling over Bloomsbury, draping the streets with long shadows as I made my way to the tube station at Holborn. The streetlights had not yet been switched on. My thoughts went back to the symptoms that Michael was experiencing. Why was he having difficulty with his language? To my disappointment, there was a large crowd gathered outside the entrance of Holborn Station, which had been closed, supposedly because the number of people inside was dangerously high. In typical British style, there was no noise, apart from the man who was handing out free newspapers shouting out a headline about the latest spate of cycling fatalities on London roads. The commuters stood still as they waited patiently in the gloaming. I decided that this was not for me and walked towards Piccadilly Circus. On Shaftesbury Avenue, theater goers were milling outside some of the big show venues. I cut into Chinatown and then down Gerrard Street. As I passed the new Loon Moon Chinese supermarket, my eyes happened to glance up to a bottle green plaque on its facade. In clear white, startling text it stated, "Here in the former Turk's Head Tavern, Dr. Samuel Johnson and Joshua Reynolds founded the club in 1764. The irony made me smile. That afternoon I had seen a man who was having difficulty remembering words, and here was the haunt of the great lexicographer, Samuel Johnson, the man who had produced the first English dictionary of any note. 1. This venue had apparently been the pub where in the 18th century some of the most famous men in Georgian London met on a regular basis. Johnson and Reynolds, artist and founder of the Royal Academy of Arts, led an elite group which included the economist and philosopher Edmund Burke, the actor and playwright David Garrick, Edward Gibbon the historian, Oliver Goldsmith the novelist, the playwright and poet Richard Sheridan, Adam Smith the economist, and Johnson's biographer James Boswell. They met every Monday at 7 in the evening as the Literary Club in the Turk's Head, where apparently any topic might be discussed, except politics. 2. Johnson, from all accounts, was an extraordinary sight. William Hogarth, painter, social critic and cartoonist, unaware of his true identity, thought that he must be some monstrous idiot when he first met him. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, Johnson towered over his fellow citizens, his face in parts swollen and scarred by scrofula, tuberculous lymph nodes, his head frequently making sudden thrusts, and his mouth emitting explosive grunts, whistles or clucking noises. Johnson would have been quite an alarming figure. 3. His great friend Reynolds, who was commissioned to paint the portraits of both King George III and Queen Charlotte, also depicted Johnson on a number of occasions, including a remarkable study of the man without his shabby wig but poised with his hands contorted in odd gesticulations. Neurologists who have read Boswell's and other contemporary descriptions of Johnson's movements have been convinced that he suffered from the tics associated with Tourette's syndrome. 4. Apparently, when King George heard he was visiting the Royal Library, he dropped what he was doing to meet the famous Dr. Johnson. This was ostensibly to urge the great man to write more, but probably out of sheer curiosity and a desire to secure a first-hand sighting of the grotesque genius. As unusual as he might have looked, Johnson was widely lauded for his dictionary. 1 Published in 1755, it had taken him 8 years to compile the 2-volume folio edition, which contained the meanings of 42.773 words. In his house in Gough Square, just a 20-minute walk from the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and still open to visitors, Johnson amassed hundreds of books, underlining words in them for his assistants with the aim not only to collate these, but also to give examples of how they were used in English at that time. This focus on usage was a crucial part of his thinking. In the first edition of his dictionary, Johnson included 114.000 quotations to illustrate the usage of words. He understood that definitions change. His solution to enabling readers to appreciate the meaning of a word was to give them examples from literature. These illustrations were an attempt to provide exemplars of how an unfamiliar word might be used, its nuances and the concepts associated with it. His dictionary turned out to be a major success, having a huge influence on how subsequent ones were produced. This included the Oxford English Dictionary, the second edition of which contained over 230.000 feet main entries, spanning 20 volumes. Just as with Johnson, there were quotations to illustrate the meanings of words. The longest entry was for the verb set, which required 60.000 words to describe some 580 senses in which it might be used. But how are the meanings of words and the concepts associated with them represented in our brains? Do we possess and refer to a kind of dictionary, a mental lexicon? The vocabulary of the average adult native English speaker apparently contains approximately 10,000 names for things, nouns, alone. There are words for plants, animals, tools, musical instruments, for different types of furniture, modes of travel, all sorts of things. But why on earth was Michael having trouble finding words? I had not been able to complete my assessment when I had first seen Michael because there had been so little time. To begin with, I hadn't really determined what kind of language impairment he had, nor had I established whether his difficulties were confined to language. His trouble with finding the right word or even remembering certain words might have simply been part of a more general problem with his memory. I hadn't tested that. When he returned the following week, my aim was to focus on attempting to answer these questions. As he entered, Michael smiled slightly nervously. He had brought with him his wife, Sarah. As before, he was very elegantly dressed, this time in a blue blazer, a tie with alternating yellow and red stripes, and eye-catching white chinos, almost as if he'd stepped off a yacht and into the clinic. I thought Sarah was altogether less conspicuous, wearing a plain brown cardigan and gray herringbone trousers. She held his hand tightly as they walked in. I started by testing Michael's ability to understand language but found quite quickly that he could follow complex sets of instructions with ease. He was also able to repeat words and long sentences without difficulty, and his speech was fluent throughout, without any discernible errors. When I pointed to a series of objects around the room, he was able to name them without hesitation. His difficulties became evident, however, when I presented him with a set of line drawings of animals or objects, particularly when they were uncommon things. "And what's this?" I asked, pointing to a drawing of a penguin. "That's a bird," he said. "Yes, but what type of bird?" Now that's a question," he retorted. "Where does it live, this bird?" I persisted. "God knows. The zoo?" He beamed, rather pleased with himself for coming up with a clever answer. "Yes, but where did it come from? Somewhere hot or somewhere cold?" "Not sure. To be honest with you, I'd guess somewhere cold, but I've never been good with birds." "What about this?" I asked, pointing now to a picture of a harp. "Is it a kind of window?" "No, it's a kind of musical instrument," I explained. "Does that help?" "Not really, but then I was never very good at music." "It's a harp. Do you know what kind of sound it makes?" Michael shrugged. "Like a piano?" So it went on. Although Michael could name common objects, like a pencil or a spoon, he really struggled with more unusual items. With animals, he might know that it was a bird, but he couldn't tell me which type. When he was shown a picture of a tiger, he called it a cat, and he came to the same conclusion when shown a cheetah or a kitten. Even more telling, when Michael was asked to name as many animals as he could in a minute, he could think of only 4, resorting to common examples: dog, cat, rat and cow. And if I asked him to give me the names of different types of dog, he was stuck on 1, a Labrador. He just couldn't come up with any other examples. Michael was running out of words. His vocabulary seemed to have shrunk. But why? Was it possible that this was simply because his memory in general was beginning to be eroded? There was only one way to find out. I gave Michael a few words to remember and discovered that he could recall these very well over a period of a few seconds. If I asked him to repeat sentences of increasing complexity, he could also do this without difficulty. His short-term memory, by which psychologists mean memory for information retained over seconds, therefore appeared intact. Next, I tested his memory over longer periods of time. I gave him a list of words to learn, which he was able to do quite quickly. Then I asked him to remember them because I was going to ask him about them later. I gave him a complex line drawing to copy and asked him to remember this too because I was going to ask him to draw it from memory. 15 minutes later he could recall the words well, and also made a pretty fair copy of the drawing that I had shown him. His memory for both verbal material, the written words he had learned, and visual material, the complex figure he had drawn, seemed to be excellent. Do you listen to the news on the radio or follow it on the television? I asked. Yes, I do. Anything caught your eye in the last few days? Of course, there's that awful bombing in Syria. It's difficult to imagine how the people are coping there. Their own army has turned on them. Michael was referring to the massive artillery barrage that had been unleashed on parts of the ancient city of Homs, a focal point of the Syrian insurrection, which was now bearing the brunt of the conflict. Nearly a year on from the original Arab Spring protests, the people trapped there were caught under a rain of mortars and shells, a foretaste of what was to occur in so many other parts of the country. Then there are the economic problems in Greece. The people are fed up with austerity and are blaming it all on the Germans. With great clarity, Michael went on to recount several other stories that were in the news at that time. I asked him about recent events in his own life and, again, he could tell me in detail about trips he'd made to see his family, a holiday he'd been on in the Algarve and about a play he'd seen on London's South Bank. Sarah confirmed that the details he had given me were correct. All this suggested that his recall of events or episodes in his life was actually quite intact. However, although these aspects of his memory seemed fine, he was struggling with his memory for words and the meaning of words. His problems seemed to lie with his verbal lexicon, his mental dictionary of words and their meanings. Would it be possible to speak to Sarah alone? I asked. It's often easier to get a better understanding of how things are at home. Of course, we have no secrets, Michael said, smiling as he left the consulting room. Have you noticed any difficulties that Michael might be experiencing? Sarah flicked her graying hair back off her gaunt face and cleared her throat. I began to wonder if there was a problem a little while ago, Doctor, she said reflectively. Our grandson, Ben, as always, cracking jokes, and Michael has always loved to hear them. But I noticed 2 years ago that he wasn't understanding them. He would smile, but I could tell that he didn't get the humor. Part of the attraction of knowing Michael had apparently been his playful temperament. He always made me laugh, she said. He used to have a very mischievous sense of irony. That's all faded away. The fun has gone. I see. So he seems to have lost his sense of humor? I think it's more than that. I could see that he was struggling with the names of some of those drawings of animals and objects you showed him. Sometimes, in conversation, he seems to forget the name of something. He'll say, Sarah, can you pass me the thingy, please? It could be the butter dish or his spectacles. Anything really. He seems to have forgotten the names of things. It's the same if I want him to get something for me. The other day, I was busy on the phone and asked him to bring me a pen to jot down some details. He came back with an envelope. When we were cooking yesterday, I asked him to pass me some garlic. He fished out some parsley. It's things like that. How he is with other people. It's been difficult. His friends don't stay as long when they visit. Sarah responded. They always used to have a laugh with him. But nowadays that's rare, and there are more awkward, stilted conversations with long pauses. If I'm honest, they don't really come to see him anymore. He has to go to them if he wants to meet up. But he's less inclined because he lacks confidence. I know he doesn't feel the same person anymore. He's worried about how his friends view him. Sarah hadn't noticed much else. Michael's personality, apart from the loss of his sense of humor, was much the same. He wasn't behaving oddly. In every way, he remained the perfect gentleman as far as she was concerned. He was never rude. He could be relied upon to pick up the grandchildren on time. He drove with care. True, he was using the computer less and now she was doing much of the online banking. But that was about it. And no, he wasn't doing anything odd like hoarding, gambling or drinking excessively as far as she knew. I brought Michael back in. Haven't been spilling the beans, have you, Sarah? He said with a wink. No more than usual, Michael, she responded, clearly pleased that he was cracking a joke. I think I'm beginning to understand the kind of difficulty you're having, I explained. We're going to need to do some more tests to look into this in detail. Michael was obviously relieved. Thank goodness. I was worried that you wouldn't believe I had any kind of problem. Thank you for taking this seriously, doctor. I'm going to arrange an MRI scan of your brain and some more testing of your language, memory and thinking with one of our neuropsychologists. They can probe a little deeper into your difficulties and perhaps help us to understand a bit more about why you're having problems finding the right words. Oh good, thank you. I really want to find out what's going on. So, to be honest, did I? Why had Michael's vocabulary shrunk? One thing that most of us might agree upon is that, even if we had the inclination, we don't have the capacity to learn all the entries in a small dictionary. Let alone the Oxford English Dictionary. We don't retain verbatim definitions of words, or the many nuanced ways in which they might be used, or examples of how they have been deployed in literature. That's why Dr. Johnson put together his massive work in the first place, to save us trying to retain all that information. If the human brain were to store so much information in the way Johnson had designed his dictionary, it would soon become overwhelmed. We, nevertheless, hold a remarkable amount of information about the world around us. People, places, living things, non-living things, historical and scientific facts, abstract ideas. How do we do it? Research performed by psychologists in the 1960s first suggested that we do indeed possess a form of mental lexicon linked to a knowledge database of sorts. But this representation in our brains is very different from even a short dictionary. Point 5. Rather than having a separate entry for each word with definitions for every one of them, our repository of knowledge seems to be set up to understand the relationships between words and, most importantly, the concepts that go along with them. For example, we know that canaries, larks and starlings are all birds. It might therefore make sense in any representation of knowledge to keep all the information that is common to birds close together, while things that aren't birds, like fish or cats, or tables and chairs, should be kept further away because they belong to different groups of objects. Fig. 2. Hierarchical classification of knowledge. A semantic network. Proposal for how information about animals might be stored in the brain. Adapted from Collins and Quillian, 1969. 5. Objects that we classify as being in the same category, some psychologists argued, are closer to each other in the way our brains organize this information. Furthermore, they are stored in a hierarchical system, like a branching tree of knowledge. Fig. 2. Concepts act as rules for the way we categorize information. A particular superordinate category, like bird, would include all the examples of the concept bird. This format appears to be in economical compact way to retain information about items that are similar because they have close conceptual links between them. Instead of keeping separate definitions of canaries, larks, starlings, and any other birds, we can keep a single entry that brings together the attributes that are common to all of them, and indeed most other birds. In other words, we have a generic definition for birds. This might, for example, specify that in general they all have beaks, feathers, and the ability to fly. This kind of insight, I thought, might also be important in what I had observed in Michael. He could name only 4 animals, and these were all common exemplars: dog, cat, rat, and cow. And when asked to name different breeds of dog, he could think of only one, a relatively common one, a Labrador. It was as if his tree of knowledge, the way he represented words, had been severely pruned back to just a few branches. He knew about dogs, but seemed to have lost the names of any breed other than one. Was it possible that he was running out of words because his mental lexicon, not only for the words themselves but for their conceptual meanings, was slowly degrading? Was that why, in our previous meeting, he didn't know what a lawnmower was or how was it used? In the 1980s, researchers who studied how our brains store words and their meanings started to question the original proposal that knowledge was represented in a tree-like hierarchical structure, Fig. 2. One particular line of work that led to this questioning was a set of studies into how we represent some unusual exemplars of a category of items. For example, ostriches and penguins in the superordinate category of birds. Neither ostriches nor penguins fly. So, we'd expect these uncommon birds to have some other attributes attached to them in our representations of these words. One of them swims, the other has very big legs, and so on. Conceptually, though, each one is a bird. But, clearly, they are different to most other birds we know. Indeed, when psychologists tested how quickly people classified canaries and ostriches as birds, they found that they performed this classification much faster for canaries. Yet the model shown in Fig. 2, on face value at least, might predict there would be no difference in speed of response. Because ostriches and canaries are equidistant from the superordinate category of bird, findings such as this led scientists to question the hierarchical system that was originally proposed to explain our database of semantic knowledge. Instead of agreeing with this view, they developed new models of how words and their associated concepts are stored in the brain. 6 The inspiration for the structure of these models came from 3 key insights that neuroscientists had gained about how neurons, nerve cells, in the brain work. The first was that neurons are connected to many other neurons, allowing for parallel distributed processing, PDP, so that signals can be broadcast simultaneously across many nerve cells. The second was that the strength of these connections between neurons can alter with learning. Some connections can grow stronger if they are frequently active, whereas others can become weaker. Finally, networks of neurons can receive signals when errors are made, so that they can effectively learn from their mistakes. In fact, the error signals can propagate through a network to strengthen or weaken some of the connections between neurons that might have led to the mistake. These new models are sometimes referred to as PDP, connectionist models, because they consist of networks which have connections between units representing neurons in the brain. They represent concepts in a completely different way to conventional hierarchical systems. In connectionist models, a concept such as a canary is represented by the pattern of activity across the entire network, not just by a node within a hierarchy. Initially, a neural network may not be very good at differentiating a canary from other living things, let alone from ostriches. However, with training through many iterations of learning, where the network is fed back its mistakes by a process known as backpropagation, the connections between the units in the network slowly alter. Some get stronger, others grow weaker until the network can perform extremely well at classifying a concept, such as a canary, and all the properties that belong to it. Not only that, but it can generalize to other related concepts, because similar concepts will have very similar patterns of activity across the network. A new concept, such as say a starling, will be learned very quickly. These connectionist approaches have been found to be highly effective in accounting for several aspects of human semantics. They have, for example, shown how it is possible for the distributed pattern of activity within a neural network to learn concepts just as children do during development, and crucially also how this knowledge might be degraded in brain diseases. Point 6. These approaches to semantics were the forerunners of the artificial intelligence revolution, which has drawn on neural networks and back propagation as key mechanisms with which to solve a wide range of problems. Could the organization of semantic knowledge also be relevant to understanding the kinds of problem that Michael was experiencing? A couple of weeks later, Michael went on to receive detailed cognitive testing from one of my neuropsychology colleagues. She agreed that his longer-term or episodic memory was intact. When we speak of memory, most of us usually mean recollections of events, episodes from our past. This is what neuropsychologists refer to as episodic memory. And just as I had found on brief testing, she also concluded that this particular cognitive function was working well in Michael. However, like me, she observed that he encountered great difficulty in naming pictures and even some real objects that she showed him. This could be whether he was seeing, hearing, or touching an item. For example, he couldn't find the name for a set of keys when he was shown them, but he also failed to recognize them when he simply heard the keys jangling, or when he was allowed to touch them with his hand with his eyes shut. Michael's difficulties, she noted in her report, extended to matching words to pictures. When he was shown a word such as swing or watch, he couldn't pick the right object that matched these words from a selection of pictures. So, he definitely had a problem in finding the names of things. But his difficulties extended beyond naming. She had found that he had great trouble in sorting objects, and this was very telling to me, according to how similar they were. For example, most people consider a stool to be similar to a chair, as is a sofa, whereas a bin and a lamp are very different. Michael apparently thought all these domestic objects were similar, with no difference in the degree of similarity between them. He was also unable to demonstrate the proper use of many of the objects she showed him. For example, when presented with a screwdriver, he used it like a spoon, and when given a hammer, he used it like a saw. He didn't seem to know what a key was for at all. It wasn't, therefore, simply that he was suffering from a problem with naming objects. It was understanding the concepts associated with these objects. It was about their meaning. Michael, she concluded, seemed to be losing his knowledge about the world and the things that occupy it. His semantic memory. Point 7. Semantic memory is the term psychologists use to refer to our knowledge base. Do you know how many months there are in a year? What's a fish? Is a shark a fish? What about an octopus? How many different ways can you use a knife? Think about it. Your answers to this question depends upon the context. You can use a knife to cut bread, but a different action is required to spread butter on toast, and still a different technique is required if you want to scoop some jam out of jar with a knife, and, of course, there's yet Another completely different way of using a knife if you want to harm someone. Somehow all this information accompanies the word knife. We carry it with us as we've learned about the uses of a knife. We even know that there are different types of knives. Ones for cheese, or to cut steak, or perhaps peel fruit, or cut bread. This type of knowledge is referred to as semantic memory. It is our conceptual understanding. It comes to cover a vast territory as we learn about the world we occupy. Thus, while Michael's episodic memory was intact, he seemed to be losing his semantic memory. That's what sometimes made it difficult for him to find the right word in conversation. This tallied with the impression that I'd obtained in the clinic. His difficulties in conversation went deeper than being able to retrieve the correct word, though he was struggling to understand what that word meant. The concepts associated with a label such as scrum or lawnmower. Our understanding of a word is not just tied to a tag or a label, the word itself, but it is also intimately connected to the concepts that are linked to that word. The Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez appreciated this well. 8 in his landmark novel, 100 Years of Solitude. The inhabitants of his fictitious town of Macondo suffer from a plague of insomnia, but it is a very unusual form of insomnia, one which leads to the loss of the name and notion of things. One of the townsfolk becomes so aware of this that he takes to sticking labels on objects, table, chair, clock, door, and so on, simply so that he can remember what they are called. However, he realized that the day might come when things would be recognized by their inscriptions, but that no one would remember their use. In other words, even if they had the label, the word for an object, the townsfolk wouldn't know the concept that goes with it. How to use a table or a chair, how to milk a cow, or what to do with any of the objects or animals around them. Concepts aren't just linked to objects, they're also associated with abstract words like truth, love, democracy, and by combining concepts we have the ability to create a huge, almost infinite combination of ideas and thoughts. These can be novel or highly creative thoughts, but they're all built on simpler ideas which we construct effortlessly with the words that we attach to them. The label is simply shorthand for a rich set of information, knowledge about the concept stored with the label. Consider, for example, the word English. It means so much more than the English language. It captures a vast range of qualities and characteristics, some historical, some social, many about the sort of person who we might anticipate to be English. Even without all this knowledge, as a brown child walking down the street in 1960s London, I came to know very quickly that I definitely wasn't English. The names people called me made me understand that concept quite vividly. I recall that, as an excited 9-year-old, when I first moved with my family from London to live in Birmingham, I was at first very disappointed. I had great difficulty making sense of what the locals, the Brummies, were saying. Their accent sounded completely foreign to me. Lovely people, but I don't understand them, I wrote emphatically in my diary. Soon, though, I began to realize that there were different types of English people: urban, rural, northern, Brummie, Cockney, and a whole lot more, all with different ways of speaking. In fact, there are many different types of northern accent alone, from Yorkshire or Lancashire, from Liverpool or Manchester, from Newcastle or Cumbria, and so on. The nuances between the concepts attached to each of these characteristics of Englishness are vast, but they only came into my semantic knowledge base with experience accumulated over many years. So, I understood that semantic memory grows with time, but could it also become degraded? Tilde oh tilde. Michael's scan came back a few days later. I received an alert to tell me it had been reported. When I looked at it, the result was obvious. Much of his brain looked pretty normal, but the left temporal lobe was definitely abnormal. In fact, the very tip of it, the temporal pole, was shrunken and withered. Point 9 It was atrophied. This is the characteristic finding in a relatively rare condition called semantic dementia, in which people progressively lose their semantic memory. Fig. 3.10 In fact, rather astonishingly, this loss specifically of semantic memory is exactly what Garcia Marquez described as occurring in his fictional account of what happened to the people of Macondo. Fig. 3. The brain in semantic dementia. On the left is a normal healthy brain, with the left temporal lobe shaded. In semantic dementia, the very anterior part of the left temporal lobe, called the temporal pole, shrinks, as shown on the right hand image, leading to loss of semantic memory. Regardless of precisely how semantic knowledge is represented in our brain, whether it is a hierarchical classification system or more like a neural network, connectionist model, studies of healthy people as well as patients with semantic dementia have now led to the consensus that a key part of that representation is located at the very tip of the left temporal lobe. Point 11 This semantic store is multimodal. It holds the look, sound, touch, even the smell and taste of an item, if these are relevant. So, when a patient with semantic dementia begins to lose their understanding of the word keys, they also start to encounter difficulty in accessing all the attributes associated with keys, what they are made of, their size and shape, their weight and feel, the jangling sound they make when a set of them is shaken, as well as what keys are in. Most importantly, how they are used. Intriguingly, detailed testing of people with neurological conditions, including semantic dementia, has revealed that the representations of living things might be stored separately to non-living objects within the brain. Point 12 Some patients can show impaired knowledge of living things, especially animals, fruit and vegetables, while retaining a relatively intact understanding of non-living things, objects such as tools, while others show the opposite. These findings offer further evidence to constrain how scientists model the architecture of semantic knowledge representations in the human brain. Point 13 When I saw them next, Michael and Sarah were keen to find out the results of his scan. I'm afraid it isn't normal, I said. No, not normal. In what way? One part of the brain is smaller than it should be. It has shrunk. Oh. Sarah gripped her husband's hand. Yes, and I'm afraid it's that part of the brain that is involved in holding a store of the meanings of words. The results of the scan fit with your concerns about not being able to find the right word at times. Michael seemed partly relieved that something had been found to explain his symptoms, but he was also clearly worried. I see. Which part of the brain is it? Let me show you. I turned my computer screen so he could see the scan as I pointed to the abnormal part. You see this left part of what we call the temporal lobe. It's much smaller than on the right side of the brain. And does it matter that it is on the left? He asked. Yes, for most of us, language functions are in the left hemisphere. There are lots of different components of language. The processes that give us our understanding of words and their meanings are thought to be located here, right here in the tip of the left temporal lobe. 14. And that's why I'm having problems. I'm afraid so. Michael closed his eyes. When he opened them, he avoided my gaze and asked what everyone wants to know. Is this going to get worse? I think that is likely, but it may occur very slowly. So eventually I'll run out of words? I didn't respond. It wasn't just words that Michael would struggle to remember, but also his knowledge of the world, the concepts that go with the words. It was difficult to say this to him. I had just given him the diagnosis, and it would be miserable to say all this at the same time. Everyone's different. Some people progress very slowly. Semantic dementia can be hard for a doctor to spot. Most won't even be aware that it exists. Those who do may not be able to find anything remarkable in a patient's speech unless they assess it carefully and consider the patient's history with that specific diagnosis in mind. Family members and friends are sometimes invaluable in picking up important clues. Often patients' speech reveals a tendency to use generic terms, such as animal, instead of a specific example, like dog. As Sarah had noted, Michael had been using the term thingy when he couldn't think of a word. Even in their drawings, people with semantic dementia may start to generalize, revealing their lack of knowledge of specific details. A patient asked to depict different animals might resort to drawing a default form with very few of those detailed characteristics that distinguish a fish from a bird or a dog. Fig. 4. Sarah's observations about Michael losing his sense of humor were also quite insightful. To understand a joke requires a person not only to have the vocabulary to comprehend what is said, but also the elaborate concepts linked to the words that are uttered. Mark Twain, a man celebrated for his turn of phrase, once described an acquaintance as a good man in the worst sense of the word. 15. Taken at face value, this comment might be perplexing because good doesn't seem to be used in a familiar way here. The humor emerges only if our conceptual understanding extends beyond the plain meaning of good. In the way Twain paints him, this man is possibly self-righteous, perhaps hypocritical, certainly not at all good. The negative meaning that is conveyed is the result of Twain's audience having an understanding more subtle and varied than a simple definition of the word. The semantic theory of humor developed by the linguist Victor Raskin proposes that the punchline of a joke works only if it leads to the audience abruptly shifting from the more obvious, primary meaning of a word to a secondary, often opposing, way in which it is being used in the joke. 16. But to understand that shift requires a richer semantic understanding of the information associated with a word. Ironically, in the case of Mark Twain's acerbic comment, good can also be used to mean bad. For Michael, that sophisticated conceptual understanding of meanings beyond the surface definition of words was seemingly the first thing to go. Without an understanding of their extended meanings, not simply their dictionary definitions, but all the other information that is associated with them, it had become difficult for him to comprehend why something was funny. His interactions with friends had slowly become more limited, far narrower in scope, but this wasn't because of his conversational ability. He could clearly talk, sometimes in a very compelling fashion, as I had observed when I first met him. Fig. 4. Drawings by a patient with semantic dementia. Note how each animal has a very similar generic form, with the fish lacking fins, the top bird having no wings, and the elephant missing a trunk. Adapted from Raskovsky et al. 2009. 8. But retaining connections with people involves more than the straightforward exchange of information. We also need to enjoy their company, one key element of which is the mutual appreciation of what we find to be funny. Laughter is crucial for social bonding and may even be an important evolutionary mechanism to influence our sense of belonging to a group. 17 Shared humor motivates us to stay in touch. However, such humor requires a common understanding of the wider semantics associated with the words we use. If we lose this, it can become difficult to hold on to friendships, as Michael was evidently now finding. For me, as an immigrant child growing up in Birmingham, even after I had become accustomed to the accent and familiarized myself with the nuances of the local slang, I still found British humor bewildering. Maybe I shouldn't have been too worried, as I now know that it has a reputation around the world for being baffling. Sometimes considered rude or, worse, offensive, it can be hard for an outsider to appreciate why sarcasm or irony, two common features of the British sense of humor, are considered to be so very funny. For example, in the 1970s television series Fawlty Towers, an American guest asks Basil Fawlty, the proprietor of the eponymous hotel, "Is there anywhere they do French food?" Fawlty responds, "Yes, France, I believe. They seem to like it there. And the swim would certainly sharpen your appetite." Taken at face value, this might seem at best bizarre, at worst extremely rude, but in Britain it is deemed extraordinarily funny in the context of the character of Basil Fawlty and his misanthropic, snobbish approach to his chosen profession. Appreciating humor is now recognized as an important example of how semantic knowledge is crucial for a person's social identity. It is important not only as a way to retain membership of a social group but also to gain entry into one, to make effective, lasting connections, to become and remain part of a group, requires an understanding of how the members of that group conceptualize the world, including what they find funny. Without such an understanding, any relationship is likely to be superficial. This was the predicament Michael now found himself in. Sarah was anxious to find out more about semantic dementia, to know whether anything could be done, or if there were any clinical trials of new treatments. I fielded her questions, one by one. No. Michael's condition was not Alzheimer's disease. The shrinking of the left temporal pole that occurs in semantic dementia is very unlike what happens in Alzheimer's disease. In that condition, a different part of the brain, called the hippocampus, atrophies, and with it goes episodic memory, but semantic memory can be left intact. By contrast, in semantic dementia the hippocampus can be preserved. And this was consistent with the fact that Michael's memory for personal events was intact. Most patients with semantic dementia have an abnormal protein, called TDP43 or transactive response DNA binding protein 43, deposited in their brains. 0.18, whereas a very different protein is deposited in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease. Semantic dementia and Alzheimer's disease are two different diseases. Unfortunately, there weren't any new drug trials, although some people were advocating intense therapy that involved relearning vocabulary, rather like a child first learns new words by looking at pictures of objects and naming them. And no, there wasn't any evidence that changing one's diet, or anything else for that matter, would affect the trajectory of the illness, and sadly, no, we don't understand why some people got it and others didn't. Michael was uncharacteristically quiet. "But how have you been since I last saw you, Michael? Do you have any other questions for me?" "I've been okay, thanks. I'm just a bit ashamed." "Ashamed? Why's that?" "Well, I'm ashamed I've got this and all the, He was trying to find the right word. "Trouble, all the trouble I'm putting everyone to," he blurted. "It's embarrassing, and I don't really feel as if I fit in, belong, with everyone else." Sarah held out her hand to him again. "Darling," she said kindly, "you'll always belong." But unfortunately, that wasn't to be the case. The clinic waiting room was busy. Several of the neurologists' lists had been overbooked. There were many urgent referrals and we simply did not have sufficient capacity to deal with the level of demand in the National Health Service. People were evidently getting frustrated. It didn't help that it was raining heavily, and everyone had come into the hospital bedraggled and dripping. "Does the doctor know I'm here? Is it likely to be long?" The nurses were doing their best to appease our patients by offering cups of lukewarm, milky tea to anyone who looked impatient. This was Britain, after all. I smiled. In one corner I spotted Michael. He was still dressed very elegantly, but he wasn't sitting down. I looked more closely. He was stroking one of the leaves on a rubber plant in the waiting area. With great tenderness, as I approached, I could hear him saying, "There, there, don't be frightened. No tea for you." Other patients were deliberately looking away, keeping a safe distance from him. I tapped him on the shoulder. "Aha, the butcher. So good to see you." Sarah, who was sitting on a chair by his side, flinched. She was about to correct him, but I extended out my palm to stop her and smiled at Michael. Michael squeezed my hand tightly. "So very good. Very good to see you too. And you, too. So very, very good to see you," he continued. When we eventually got into the consulting room, Michael was beaming. "He's extremely pleased to see you," said Sarah. "He thinks the world of you because you were able to explain what he had." Michael nodded forcefully. "How have you been?" Well, very well. What have you been up to?" "A lot of things. Rugby." "Rugby?" Yes, rugby. He went to see England play at Twickenham over the weekend. "And really enjoyed it," explained Sarah. "Yes, Twickers. Had a great time." "Yes, Twickers." Michael grinned. But there was no more. It had been 3 years since the initial diagnosis, and clearly, Michael's language had changed considerably over the intervening period. His speech was now far more limited. His vocabulary far more contracted. When I spoke to Sarah alone, having guided Michael back to the waiting room, she confirmed that he was now unable to communicate effectively. He could speak, even repeat words and sentences, but his lack of understanding of what words meant was having a profound impact. He was often unable to comprehend what people were saying. It wasn't just jokes or humor that he had difficulty with now. At first, he found infrequently used words challenging, embarrassing, which he had once used in his conversation with me, had become a puzzling concept, but now his bewilderment was apparently extending to common words. His regular vocabulary had shrunk ever smaller, to a set of nouns like house, car, and food. Sarah had been surprised that he had used rugby when talking to me. "It's very hard," she confessed. "I've lost the man I married." She frowned, holding back her tears. Sarah went on to explain that although she and the children had initially been very sympathetic, they had become increasingly exasperated by Michael's inability to understand even simple instructions. In turn, he had grown irritated with their responses towards him, which slowly became nothing more than perfunctory nods or shakes of the head. Hardly any of his friends came to visit him. He would often go out driving to get away, but now was no longer able to do so. He had lost his driving license, not because he had any difficulty driving, but because he was no longer able to understand what road signs and symbols meant. On one occasion, Michael had gone down a road with a "no entry" sign to find himself driving headlong into oncoming traffic on the wrong side of a dual carriageway. He was lucky to be alive. At home, his behavior had become similarly bizarre. He would often attempt to flush clothes down the toilet because it seemed that he thought it was a washing machine. He'd urinate in plant pots, mistaking them for toilets, and, worst still, he would try to eat rotting food that had been thrown away in the bin. Petting the rubber plant in the waiting room was nothing, Sarah concluded. Outside, through the window of my room in the clinic, I could see the rain still pelting down over the square, beating a disturbing tattoo over the pavements and car roofs, drenching even those people with their umbrellas held aloft. It was grim. Inside, the atmosphere had also become leaden. I'm so very sorry to hear how things have deteriorated. Sarah shrugged. No news on any new treatments, I suppose? She asked. I'm afraid not. There was a gentle knocking at the door. It opened slowly and there was Michael holding a cup. Tea? He inquired, smiling. He came over to Sarah, placing the cup down gently on my desk. He put his arms around her shoulders and held her very tight as he kissed her on the cheeks. One thing was for sure, he clearly understood her pain. Sarah closed her eyes. He's very much still my husband. Thank you, Michael said, nodding at her, looking at me with those wonderful sapphire eyes, he explained, pointing to his mouth. No words, but thank you. And with that he put his arm through hers. And they walked quietly out of the clinic into the rain. 3. Losing my memory? She marched into the consulting room with purpose and an air of self-assurance. He looked beaten by his circumstances. Trish was a short, slight woman, almost bird-like in her appearance. She wore a large black padded coat with an elaborate fleece hood, a creamy collar of plumage which almost threatened to overwhelm her. But somehow you knew that she was in charge. Perhaps it was the emphatic cadence of her entry, the stomp of her heels sharply beating a regular meter. Perhaps it was the way her eyes fixed straight upon me, her face narrowing quizzically, assessing with evident disdain the specialist she had come to see. Whatever it was, Trish looked so much more confident than the man trailing behind her. Nice to meet you, doctor, she said with conviction as she shook my hand firmly. Good morning, I responded. And you must be? I asked her companion. I'm Steve, her partner, he explained quietly. He wanted me to come here, she interjected. I'm sure you'll say that it was all a big mistake, and that there was absolutely no need. And we'll be done with it. I know that we're wasting your time, doctor, but he always worries, does our Steve, she added with a grin. Does he? Well, perhaps I might start by asking you what he's concerned about. He thinks I'm losing my memory, but there really is nothing to get worked up about. I'm just not as good as I used to be about remembering stuff. But who is? Doctor, who is? I nodded, noticing the slight Irish lilt to her accent. How long do you think there's been a problem? I asked. But there isn't a problem, she said, beaming broadly with a dramatic shrug of her shoulders. Steve closed his eyes. He'd obviously heard this many times before. I see, but what kind of things has Steve become worried about? Well, nothing really. Of course, I forget a few things here and there, make a few mistakes, but we all do. I'm sure you do too. Don't tell me you don't, doctor, she inquired, fixing me with a smiling stare. So, apart from your memory, is there anything else that's a problem for you? I asked, avoiding her question. Not a thing. I'm as bright as a button, she said, looking very pleased. I went on to take the rest of the history from her. But this didn't reveal a great deal. Trish was in her mid-50s and worked as a receptionist for a firm of solicitors. She'd been born to Irish parents who had moved to the UK. You couldn't take the Irish out of her, as she made clear several times during our conversation. Trish had apparently married young and regretted doing so. She had two children from that relationship before she got divorced 10 years ago. She'd met Steve shortly afterwards. Her children had now left home and were working. She didn't have any past medical history of note. She didn't take any medications, smoke or drink alcohol excessively. Her family history was equally unremarkable. There was nobody that she knew who had suffered from memory problems. Would you mind if I spoke to Steve? I asked. Not at all, doctor. You go right ahead. You're not going to say anything about me that I might object to now, would you, darling? She asked mischievously as she turned her gaze towards Steve. I meant on his own. Without you, we often find it helpful to get the perspective of someone who knows you well, I explained. Oh, I see, she said, a little taken aback, her lips opening momentarily, revealing her apprehension. Well, of course, yes. I took Trish out into the waiting area. When I returned to the consulting room, Steve was leaning forwards, his head down, cupped in his hands. His posture captured his mood. I hope you don't mind me talking to you alone? I asked. No, I'm really very grateful. I never usually get the chance to explain things about Trish to a doctor without her being there, so thank you. What has been the main problem from your point of view? Where do I start? Her memory can be appalling. It's unbelievable at times, and it's driving me mad. When do you think she was last completely normal? Steve told me how he had noted that Trish's recall of information had been deteriorating over 4 years. It had started in a very mild manner, hardly noticeable at first, but now she was making mistakes at work, forgetting to enter information into her firm's calendar, double booking appointments in, most disconcertingly, not recognizing important clients when they came for meetings. At home, she might forget conversations she couldn't be relied on to pay credit card bills on time or to keep important appointments. Her personality was apparently unchanged, although she was now behaving oddly at times. How do you mean, oddly? I asked. There was a long pause. Steve was clearly reticent to explain, but eventually he spoke. It's got to the point where she doesn't even seem to recognize me sometimes. We went on a little break to Cornwall a few months ago. It was nice to get away. We had a lovely few days at this fishing village, really lovely, but when it came to the time to leave, it became clear she didn't know who I was. How did it become clear? I asked. Well, I told her I'd get the car ready and then we'd drive back home to London, but she became very anxious. She was fretting at the prospect. I mean, she was really worried. I didn't know why at first, but do you know what she said? I shook my head. She told me that I couldn't possibly go home with her because Steve, her partner, would be there and he definitely wouldn't be pleased if she came home with me. Can you believe that? I nearly keeled over. She said that she'd had a fantastic time, but she was so very sorry. It would be too much for Steve. He was the jealous type. She promised she'd keep in touch, but she couldn't possibly take me home. She was going to drive back alone. She really couldn't give me a lift. So, what did you do? I had to think on my feet because she was adamant that I wasn't coming with her. She'd already sat in the car with her bags, but none of mine. I told her that I was a mate of Steve's and she could try calling him to check that it would be all right to give me a lift. Somehow, I managed to persuade her to do that, and while she called on her phone from the car, I walked away and responded to her on my mobile. I told her that it would be perfectly fine for her to bring along my friend. He was a good mate and there was nothing to worry about. She could give him a lift. She eventually agreed to drive me home. It was crazy. He paused. Let me get this right, I said, trying to make sense of this remarkable story. Before you mentioned that you were a friend of Steve's, who did she think you were? Another long pause. She seemed to believe I was her lover. But not that you were a second Steve? Well, It's difficult to know because what she says can vary. Another time, a couple of weeks ago, in our house, she said I'd better leave before Steve came home. I had to tell her I was Steve. When she laughed as if she didn't believe me, I showed her a photo on the mantelpiece of us together. Of course, then she said she was only joking, but I know she wasn't. So, I agreed. That does sound like she might not recognize you. That's what I thought, but I think it's worse than that. One evening last week she said, I wish all you Steves would sort yourselves out and decide who is staying with me tonight. I think at times she really believes there are several of us. Is that even possible? He asked, his face a picture of confusion. I nodded. Sometimes that can happen. Steve's initial descriptions had made me wonder whether Trish was having difficulty recognizing people, but it seemed that at times she thought there were duplicates of Steve. In 1923, the French psychiatrist Joseph Cagrat described a woman, also in her 50s, who had become paranoid. She was convinced that members of her family, including her children and husband, had somehow been supplanted by people who were doubles. The patient, Madame M, was suffering from a delusion in which she believed that people she knew had been replaced by imposters. Ever since then we have referred to this phenomenon as the Cagrat syndrome. 1 It seemed that sometimes Trish really was convinced that Steve had his own set of doppelgangers. Just 3 years after Cagrat's description of his famous case, his colleagues described a woman, also in Paris, who had come to believe that she was being pursued by two famous actresses of that period, Sarah Bernhardt and Rabin. In her mind, they were able to take the form of people she knew. They could enter other people's bodies, including those of her friends, and in this guise these actresses tormented her. This paranoid belief of different people being the same person in disguise was termed the Fragoli delusion, in honor of the Italian actor Leopold Fragoli, who had become famous around Europe for his speedy transitions between impersonations of different celebrities such as Verdi, Wagner or Rossini. Both the Cagrat and Fragoli delusions are now considered to be part of a spectrum of delusional misidentification syndromes, observed in some people who develop paranoid thinking such as in schizophrenia. They sometimes occur in patients with other brain disorders too. She's also repeating herself. Steve continued. I'll answer a question, but she'll only ask me the same thing again a few minutes later, and then a few minutes after that, and then sometimes she just makes stuff up that never happened, but she's convinced it did. It's driving me mad. There must be a reason. Doctor. I brought Trish back into the consulting room and asked Steve to sit in the waiting area while we chatted. I hope he hasn't been saying anything naughty about me, she asked with a cheeky smile, but she was clearly anxious to learn what had been discussed. Oh no, not at all. I think he's become worried about you. Tell me, do you follow the news? What's going on in the world? I do and I don't, responded Trish. She had obviously developed her defenses well. What about over the last few weeks? Has anything caught your eye? Well, there's the whole impeachment issue in the States. Impeachment? I asked curiously. Yes, you know, Nixon. Watergate's been devastating for the Yanks. I feel for them. Of course, you would be devastated if you found out that your president was such a liar. Trish went on to explain what had happened in the Watergate scandal but didn't seem to appreciate that she was speaking about events that had occurred decades ago. Anything else that's been important in the world? Well, there's the Middle East. There's always a problem there. She smiled. This time it's awful. I saw the terrible news about those children who were attacked with chemicals in Syria. That was terrible. She went on to describe in some vivid detail the chemical weapons attack in Ghouta, which had indeed happened only recently. Now more than 2 years since the initial violence in Syria had begun, but her memory let her down with her next sentence. Nixon has to do something. If he can bomb Cambodia, he can do the same in Syria now, can't he? Trish was confabulating, mistaken in her belief that Nixon was still President of the United States. This, I thought, was probably what Steve had meant when he had said that she made things up, while remaining convinced that she was right. Do you know who Barack Obama is? I asked, curious to know what she would say. Of course, he's trying to beat Nixon in the next election. Lovely chap, I'd vote for him. Later, I found out from Steve that the night before they'd been watching a television documentary about the Vietnam War and Nixon. Somehow those events that took part decades ago had been transposed and interwoven with those of the present. Tell me, Trish, have you been away for a holiday or a break this year? Yes, Cornwall. How was that? Absolutely stunning. I had a fantastic time. I'd go back in a flash. Have you been, Doctor? Yes, I have. Where did you stay? She paused for a long time. I'd like to say Truro, but I can't be sure that was the name of the place. I knew from Steve's description of the Cornish village that it couldn't be Truro. And who were you with? What do you mean? She asked suspiciously. Well, did you go with anyone? No, I just went on my own, she said coyly. Are you sure? Can we speak in confidence, Doctor? She asked, fixing me once again with a deep stare. Yes, of course. There was a long pause. I went with a man I've met recently, she confessed. But I wouldn't want Steve to know. He would be so upset. And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure about this new chap either. He can play hot and cold at times. Strangely enough, he's also called Steve. Would you believe it? Tilda. I tried to assess Trish's memory further. She was able to recall events from the distant past well, where she went to school, her first job, and the address of the house she lived in with her ex-husband. However, it became clear that she struggled to recall any new information. For example, 10 minutes after I gave her a name and address to remember, she couldn't recollect any of it. This is a simple clinical test of episodic memory, the ability to recall information from a previous episode in time. It is a cognitive function that requires the hippocampus, a beautifully shaped brain structure that resembles the curved arc of a seahorse, located deep on the inside of the temporal lobe, Fig. 5. Hence the Greek origin of its name, hippos, meaning horse, and campos, a sea monster. Fig. 5. The hippocampus. A view of the right hippocampus shown from the midline, with the brain structures that lie adjacent to it. These include the entorhinal cortex, which is considered to be the gateway en route through which nerve fibers enter the hippocampus. Research into the brains of different species has revealed that the hippocampus is an ancient structure which has evolved from the very origins of vertebrates, backboned animals. In mammals, it plays a crucial role in binding together information that belongs to a particular episode in time. The what, where, and who of a moment. That was experienced. Point 2. What happened? Where did it occur? Who was there? Without the hippocampus, people suffer from severe amnesia. They find it almost impossible to remember new information, but intriguingly, they can often recall events from the distant past. They show a marked gradient in their memory such that they find the most recent incidents hardest to recollect, whereas older ones are much more firmly embedded. That damage to the hippocampus leads to deficits in episodic memory was first appreciated spectacularly in the case of patient Him. In the 1950s, as a young man, He had a radical surgical procedure performed to treat his epilepsy, which had failed to respond to the drugs available to neurologists at that time. His neurosurgeon at the Montreal Neurological Institute, William Scoville, offered him a new option: resection of the hippocampus on both the left and right side of the brain. The operation turned out to be a success for H.M. His seizures reduced in frequency, but it also had unexpected consequences. After the surgery, he seemed unable to lay down new memories. For example, he would forget that he had been speaking to his doctor minutes beforehand. Years later, Suzanne Corkin, who with Brenda Milner studied H.M.'s memory in great detail over decades, would recount how he would never remember who she was, even though she would reintroduce herself at each meeting. 3 But, just as strikingly, whose name was revealed after his death to be Henry Molaison, had very little memory of what had happened in the years before his operation. It was almost as if he was living in a permanent present tense. 3. People like him raise a question that many of us might never consider. How are memories formed? We remember information so effortlessly, but how? Neuroscientists have been intrigued by how neurons in the brain are capable of storing a seemingly endless number of experiences throughout a lifetime. How do nerve cells create a memory? Everyone is agreed that something has to change in the brain when a new memory is formed. But what is it? How can cells capture the richness of our everyday lives, not only the sights, sounds, smells, and other sensory phenomena, but also the mood or the significance of a conversation or event? What exactly is the nature of a memory trace in the brain? Some researchers have coined the term engram for the neural representation that holds a memory. However, until recently, it has been very difficult to pinpoint engram cells, partly because a memory can be encoded or distributed across a group of neurons. 4. The early scientific studies inevitably had to turn to simple organisms because it was technically easier to record electrical signals from their neurons. Eric Kandel, a Jew who fled to the United States from Nazi-occupied Austria when he was a boy, made some of the pioneering contributions in this area. Of all things, he worked on the humble sea slug. 5 Although the sea slug is much simpler than most mammals, Kandel realized that its nervous system was ideal for studying how new memories are formed, for example, of a potentially threatening stimulus. By performing a painstaking series of experiments over many years, he found that the sea slug's short-term memories were associated with changes in the strength of connections between neurons at the synapses. A synapse is the technical term for where neurons meet and communicate with each other. Fig. 6. On one side of a synapse is the presynaptic neuron. Electrical impulses flow down this nerve cell to reach the synapse, which, effectively, is a gap for information to cross this gap to the neuron on the other side, the postsynaptic neuron. The electrical impulse is converted to a chemical signal. Neurotransmitter molecules released by the presynaptic neuron cross the synapse to reach and bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, triggering an electrical impulse in that nerve cell. This is how nerve cells signal to each other. Fig. 6. Short and long-term memories may be due to changes in synaptic strength or increased number of synapses between neurons. Nerve cells communicate with each other via synapses. When a presynaptic neuron is activated, it releases neurotransmitter chemical molecules. These bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron to activate it. Memory is associated with an increase in the strength of the signal across a synapse. Reactivation of the presynaptic neuron, even by a single electrical impulse, leads to easier activation of the postsynaptic neuron. This might occur because there is more neurotransmitter molecule release or because of changes in the way the post-synaptic neuron responds. Kendall discovered that when the sea slug learned a new memory, there were changes in the strength of the synapse between specific neurons. In effect, there was an increase in the signal of the information transmitted across a set of particular connections, rather like notching up the gain in an electrical circuit or the volume on a sound system. If it is repeated, the same electrical impulse in the presynaptic neuron triggers an impulse in the postsynaptic neuron far more easily. This finding is precisely what had been proposed by the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb in the 1940s. The changes in strength between synapses was captured by the phrase, neurons that wire together fire together. In other words, groups of nerve cells that are active during an event lead to the strengthening of connections between them, and this is the memory trace that's left behind. Hebbian synapses, the term now given to this mechanism, are also considered crucial for plasticity in the brain. With regards to longer-term learning in the sea slug, Kendall found that there were also increases in the number of synapses between neurons involved in creating a memory of a threatening stimulus. This groundbreaking work into memory storage in neurons ultimately led to him being awarded the 2000 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. 6. Subsequent research has moved from sea slugs to mice and confirmed the general principles that Kendall discovered. The remarkable Japanese scientist, Susumu Tonegawa, who first obtained a Nobel Prize for his work in immunology in 1990 and then switched fields completely to study neuroscience at MIT, showed how memories could be reactivated in mice. He was able to do this by stimulating specific neurons in the hippocampus that he identified as engram cells. This provided support for the theory that experiences activate a group of neurons which undergo persistent changes, and it is this collection of activated neurons that effectively holds the memory trace or engram. Subsequent reactivation of these neurons induces retrieval of that memory. Careful assessment of patients like him have led to the view that in humans, neurons in the hippocampus play a key role in encoding new information and retrieving relatively recent material. However, more distant episodes in memory might have become consolidated and stored in other brain regions such as the cerebral cortex, so they can be recalled even without an effective hippocampus. 7. This might explain a common observation made by family members of hippocampal patients, who they say have wonderful, sometimes vivid recall of long past events, but really can't remember what was said to them days, hours, or even a few minutes ago. So, the finding that Trish had difficulty with episodic memory, particularly for recent information, pointed to a dysfunction of the hippocampus. An intriguing feature of Trish's story was that she was not only forgetting information but also mixing up memories from different times. She would confabulate, recount false memories without consciously being aware that those memories were false. Understandably, scientists have become fascinated by why confabulation might occur. What has become clear is that memories are actually not like a photo or a video recording that has captured faithfully what happened. The first professor of experimental psychology at the University of Cambridge, Frederick Bartlett, conducted a large set of investigations into this question and concluded that our memories are effectively reconstructions, not replays, of events. 8. In one experiment he performed in the early part of the 20th century, Bartlett asked a group of 20 students to read War of the Ghosts, a Native American folk story. He then tested their recollection of what they had read at different intervals from minutes to weeks, months, or years. Unsurprisingly, his participants forgot details of the story as more time elapsed. But Bartlett also found that they recounted information erroneously, fitting their recollections with their own very Edwardian English cultural backgrounds. For example, some reported that the men in the story were on a sailing expedition at sea to fish, when in fact the Native Americans in the story had been in canoes on a river, hunting seals. In Bartlett's view, their memories were being incorporated into pre-existing schemas, acquired on the basis of what they knew. They were effectively recreating memories of what they had read by embedding them into a schema that they were familiar with. Donald Hebb summarized this neatly. Remembering, he argued, is rather like a paleontologist reconstructing a dinosaur from an incomplete set of remains found at a dig. The bones and teeth are put together on the basis of prior knowledge of other dinosaur skeletons. Retrieval of memories is an analogous process. Pieces of information are woven into a story by embedding them in past knowledge or a schema of what that event was probably like. So, if a person is briefly asked to sit in an office and then later questioned about what was in that room, it turns out that many people remember seeing objects that fit their schema of what an office contains, such as books or pens, even if it was the case that there were none of these items in the particular office they had been in. Point 9. Psychologists have also found that memories can be fragile for a different reason. Our recollections are vulnerable to suggestion. They can be reconstructed differently depending on the way a question is posed. In a famous experiment, Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer got students to watch films of two cars colliding and then immediately afterwards asked them questions about what they had seen. Point 10. The critical question concerned participants' estimates of the speed of the vehicles. Some of the volunteers were asked about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. But for others, the verb smashed was replaced by collided, or bumped, or contacted. Recollections of the speed of the cars varied with the verb used in the question, with the highest estimate, 40.5 miles per hour, when smashed was used, and the lowest, 31.8 miles per hour, when the question included the verb contacted. A week later, the students were asked whether they had seen any broken glass in the movie. Those who had originally been asked about the speed of the cars with the verb smashed were far more likely to say yes in response to the question, even though broken glass was not present in the film. Their reconstruction of the event a week later had been further distorted by the nature of the question posed immediately after it. Such distortions can have devastating consequences in real life. False memories can be created by the way a question is phrased. Eyewitness testimony has often been found to be unreliable in court cases, and such unreliability can be emulated in psychological experiments. In one study, people watched an 8-second security video and were subsequently asked to pick the gunman from photographs. Every observer selected someone, despite the fact that none of the people in the photos was the actual gunman. Point 11. All of these examples demonstrate the fragility of normal human memory and reveal how we all can misremember. One way to think of confabulation in patients is that it is an extreme form of how memories can be distorted in healthy people. In cases of spontaneous confabulation, such as in Trish, the patient is convinced of the truth of their stories. Indeed, the content can often be traced back to real events in their life or to what they have observed. For example, on the television, some investigations of patients who confabulate suggest that they have considerable difficulty in distinguishing between memory relevant to ongoing reality and memory of previous or relevant experiences. Point 12. More generally, they find it hard to distinguish the sources of their memories. They find it difficult to know when in time each memory comes from a source. Monitoring deficit. Trish, for example, had muddled up events from the distant past, President Nixon and the Watergate scandal, with what was happening now in Syria. Other research suggests that when a patient confabulates, the normal processes that are involved in assessing the quality of a retrieved memory are dysfunctional. Instead of finding it implausible that a series of events actually happened, the patient considers it sufficiently credible to articulate it. Either mechanism might have accounted for Trish's confabulations. Were any brain regions apart from the hippocampus affected, or for that matter working normally? In Trish, unlike Michael, discussed in the previous chapter, her semantic memory appeared largely intact. She knew the meanings of words and could name objects without difficulty. Psychologists also recognize a third type of memory system: short-term memory. Quite unlike episodic memory, this decays over just a few seconds unless the information is rehearsed, repeated. Rather like when we are trying to retain a telephone number that someone has given us but don't have anything to write it down or record it with. We performed some further tests and found that Trish's short-term memory for numbers, a test of verbal short-term memory, as well as for spatial locations, visual spatial short-term memory, was impaired. For example, she could barely remember more than a 3-digit sequence. Similarly, if I tapped out with my pen a sequence of locations on my desk, she could reproduce this correctly, but only if the sequence involved 2 or 3 locations. No more. These different types of short-term memory impairment are often indicators of parietal lobe dysfunction. 13 Verbal short-term memory impairments occur as a consequence of left parietal damage, whereas visual spatial short-term memory errors are associated with defective right parietal function. Fig. 7. Fig. 7. The parietal lobe. The parietal lobes in each cerebral hemisphere are specialized for different functions in human beings. Left parietal functions include verbal short-term memory, calculation and praxis, whereas the right parietal lobe is more specialized for visual spatial and attentional functions. But it turned out that it was more than just her short and episodic memory that Trish was having difficulty with. She struggled to do any calculations apart from simple addition, whereas previously she had apparently been very numerate. Such dyscalculia, like verbal short-term memory deficit, is also often an indicator of left parietal dysfunction. Next, I tested Trish's praxis by asking her to copy some meaningless gestures I made with my hands. She was unable to reproduce the configuration of the fingers I showed her with either hand, demonstrating that she had limb apraxia. Fig. 8. This, too, is a test of left parietal lobe function. Fig. 8. Limb apraxia and constructional apraxia. The left panel shows impaired copying of meaningless gestures, limb apraxia. The patient is attempting to copy the configuration of fingers demonstrated by the doctor on the left. The right panel shows her copy of the drawing of a cube, revealing constructional apraxia. From Taby and Hussain, 2023. 13. Finally, when I asked Trish to copy some simple line drawings, she found the task very confusing, making several attempts to reproduce the figures, but with none ending in success, a phenomenon that is termed constructional apraxia. Fig. 8, which is associated with right parietal cortex disorders. In contrast, when I gave Trish tests which assess functions of the frontal lobe, she performed relatively well. Studies of the casts of skulls of our ancestors have suggested that the parietal lobes expanded enormously in evolution. Some researchers have proposed that this is linked to 2 important skills that modern humans have acquired. 14 The first is praxis and the ability to configure our multi-jointed hands to both make and use. Tools. The implements that humans developed have become ever smaller over time, sometimes requiring a completely new set of actions to manipulate them properly. From flakes of flint used to cut meat in the Stone Age to modern watchmakers' screwdrivers and the precision tools used for microscope-assisted surgery requiring fine control of our fingers, we have come a long way in how we fabricate and use tools. Parts of the left parietal cortex, it has been argued, became highly specialized for the manual control required to both skillfully craft and employ the implements we invented. A cultural development that was crucial to the success of our species. The second important skill that humans have developed is that of being able to make plans for new constructions, to draw designs not only of dwellings and buildings, but also clothes, means of transport, from carts to rockets, and a host of objects, including tools. We are able not only to sketch plans or draw precise blueprints for ourselves, but we can also convey these in a visual format to other humans, on paper, digitally, or using scaled models. Being able to make such plans in 2 or 3 dimensions requires visio-constructive skills, which we now know are an important function of the right parietal cortex. Short-term memory, both verbal and visual spatial, together with the ability to perform calculations, are also considered to be central to the cultural transformations that have occurred in human evolution. All these cognitive processes, praxis, visio-constructive ability, calculation, verbal and visual spatial short-term memory, to which the parietal cortex makes such a fundamental contribution, have allowed us to solve complex problems, both real-world and abstract. We have the power to imagine how to develop new and ever more complex ways of constructing not only tools, but machines and large-scale structures, such as skyscrapers, cruise ships, and spacecraft. And we can communicate to others how we might do this by creating detailed plans. Small wonder that it has been argued that many important aspects of human material culture have depended on the development of the parietal cortex, with different forms of specialization of function occurring on the left and right sides of the brain. 14. The examination of Trish's cognitive functions in the clinic pointed to dysfunction of the hippocampus, episodic memory impairment, as well as that of both left and right parietal cortex, short-term memory deficits, dyscalculia, limb apraxia, and constructional apraxia. This is how neurologists go about attempting to localize which parts of the brain might not be functioning properly and where in the brain the damage might be occurring. Having done this, the next step was to turn towards thinking why this was happening. What sort of pathological process might be underlying this pattern of brain dysfunction in Trish? To a neurologist, the combination of hippocampal and bilateral parietal dysfunction, in the context of a slowly progressive history of 4 years, suggests a neurodegenerative condition that has a predilection for these specific brain regions. Top of the list of such disorders in an elderly person is Alzheimer's disease, where the pathology often appears to start just outside the hippocampus, in the entorhinal cortex, lying adjacent to the hippocampus and often considered to be the gateway to it because nerve fibers from all over the cortex converge through it. Fig. 5. The entorhinal cortex seems particularly vulnerable to the brain changes that occur in Alzheimer's. Soon this pathology spreads into the hippocampus and, if there is sufficient damage, it leads to episodic memory impairment. Then the pathology spreads further to affect the left and right parietal cortex, in turn leading to short-term memory deficits, dyscalculia, limb apraxia, and constructional apraxia. But Trish was in her mid-50s. Could she have developed Alzheimer's so early? If so, why? These were exactly the questions I asked myself as I completed the rest of the neurological examination. I looked for clues to suggest an alternative diagnosis, but there were none. Auguste Deter was about the same age as Trish when she also came to medical attention. It was 1901. Her husband, Carl, a railway clerk, had noticed for several years that her memory was not as sharp as it used to be, but her symptoms had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. Auguste started to become very suspicious. She was jealous. She became paranoid that her husband was having an affair, a fear which proved to be unfounded. Her delusions then extended to her neighbors who, she thought, were trying to kill her. Her memory also seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. In desperation, her husband took her to the institution for the mentally ill and for epileptics in Frankfurt, where she was admitted by one Alois Alzheimer, a 37-year-old psychiatrist who had a particular interest in neuropathology. Fig. 9. Fig. 9. Alois Alzheimer and his famous patient, Auguste Deter. Alzheimer's clinical notes on Frau Deter were lost for many decades but were amazingly rediscovered by chance in the 1990s. They revealed just how poor her recollection of details of her personal life were. Alzheimer became fascinated with Auguste because she had developed dementia at such a relatively young age. Indeed, when in 1903 he decided to move from Frankfurt to Munich to take up a job offer under Emil Kraepelin, perhaps the foremost psychiatrist of the time, and often considered as the founder of modern scientific psychiatry, Alzheimer asked that he be informed when Frau Deter died, so that her records and brain might be sent to him after the post-mortem. In 1906, after Auguste had passed away, Alzheimer reported his neuropathological findings at a meeting of psychiatrists in Tübingen, Germany. His talk received little attention, but in it he described two very unusual features of what he had seen under the microscope. Fig. 10. First, outside of the nerve cells, the neurons, he observed deposits of a peculiar substance, which we now call plaques, and know to be made up of the protein amyloid. Second, within many of the neurons there were tangled bundles of what seemed like tiny fibers. Nowadays we refer to these as tangles. They are made up of a different protein called tau.15. Fig. 10. Plaques and tangles in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Under the microscope, amyloid plaques outside neurons and tau tangles within them can be seen in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's findings might never have received any recognition had it not been for his boss, Kraepelin, who in his 1910 Handbook of Psychiatry generously gave the condition that Auguste Deter had suffered from the name of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer himself sadly fell ill while traveling in 1912 to take up the post of professor of psychiatry at the University of Breslau. He never really recovered and died a few years later in 1915. His legacy, however, remains strong because the microscopic features he described have been confirmed as the hallmark of the disease named after him. Moreover, cases of young-onset Alzheimer's disease, like Auguste Deter, sparked great scientific interest when it became clear in the early 1990s that there were rare cases of Alzheimer's disease which run in families. In these unfortunate people, the disease manifests in their 40s and 50s, and is associated with mutations in genes that strikingly lead to deposits of amyloid plaques in the brain. With this knowledge came the development of the hypothesis that the laying down of amyloid triggers a cascade of molecular events in the brain, ultimately causing the death of neurons in. With the passing of time, dementia. 16. This new proposal in turn led to renewed interest in research on Alzheimer's disease, including the development of techniques to measure amyloid and its co-culprit, tau. First came the ability to detect these two molecules in the cerebrospinal fluid, the liquid that bathes the brain. This can be tapped by performing a lumbar puncture, a procedure which involves inserting a needle into the lower back to draw off some of the same cerebrospinal fluid from around the lower spine. More recently, it has also been possible to measure amyloid and tau in the blood of patients suspected of having the condition. In some specialized centers, it is now possible to use new types of scan, which involve injecting a radioactive substance that binds to amyloid or to tau in order to assess more directly in the living brain whether these molecules are present in excessive amounts. These methods have begun to revolutionize how the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is made, not only in younger onset cases but also in the more common cases observed in older people. The proposal in older people is that, although a specific gene might not be to blame in these individuals, they too have amyloid deposits in their brains and that this phenomenon is the trigger that leads to the loss of neurons and dementia. Modern-day scanning techniques have also allowed us to track the progression of the pathology in Alzheimer's disease, which typically moves from the entorhinal cortex through the hippocampus and then on to the parietal cortex. I explained to Trish that we needed to perform some tests, including an MRI scan, which would show us the structure of her brain, and a lumbar puncture to examine the cerebrospinal fluid. She wasn't so keen on the latter but agreed to have it done. The MRI scans were available 3 weeks later. When I looked at them on my office computer, they were clearly abnormal, just as the cognitive assessment had suggested. Trish's hippocampi and parietal lobes on the left and right side were smaller compared to the rest of her brain. They had seemingly shrunk, which is very characteristic of the pattern observed in Alzheimer's disease. Her cerebrospinal fluid analysis confirmed my suspicions too, revealing abnormal levels of amyloid and tau, the signature findings of what Alois Alzheimer had observed in the brain of his famous patient, Auguste Deter. In view of these results, I went on to request a fluorodeoxyglucose PET, positron emission tomography, brain scan. This reveals if parts of the brain are not using glucose, the fuel that neurons require to function. Trish's scan showed that, beyond the areas which were smaller on the MRI scan, there were regions in the temporal and parietal cortex which were not taking up glucose normally, indicative of brain regions that were not functioning appropriately even though they appeared normal on the structural MRI scan. All these investigations supported my clinical impression and pointed consistently to a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Breaking the bad news proved to be surprising. Trish remained defiantly upbeat even when I showed her brain scans. "Well, I'm not going to let that kind of thing get me down, Doctor. There's a lot more of life to live and we don't know for sure I've got Alzheimer's, do we now?" she concluded. "It's true that we can't tell with 100% certainty," I responded. "To do that we'd have to look at a little bit of your brain under the microscope, and we're not going to do a brain biopsy, because that could do more harm than good. Nevertheless, all the assessments and scans you've had do make Alzheimer's the most likely diagnosis, I'm afraid," I explained. Steve was both upset and relieved. "I've been frightened that this was the cause for a long time, but at least we have an explanation now." There were tears running down his face. "What about treatment? Is there anything? I've been reading about this drug that clears amyloid protein from the brain. Could Trish try some of that?" Clearly, Steve had been researching the possibility of Alzheimer's even before I had given them the diagnosis. He'd learned about new experimental treatments that were using antibodies to bind to amyloid and promote its clearance from the brain. Some of the earlier trials had failed to show that there were any benefits to such mopping up of amyloid on the cognitive functions of patients with Alzheimer's disease. Although the drugs did clear amyloid, there had been no real impact on a patient's memory or other cognitive abilities. Nearly a decade later, more promising results were to emerge from clinical trials using this approach but with different drugs, although the benefits reported were controversial. But at the time when I was seeing Trish, there was no evidence that any drug made any material difference to the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease, nor were any licensed to be used in such a way. I'm afraid there isn't an amyloid-clearing drug that is approved for use yet, but we can start you on a drug that can make a small difference to your memory. Trish, I was referring to a medication called donepezil that didn't alter the progression of the disease but did boost the levels of acetylcholine, one of the brain's neurotransmitters, the chemicals used by nerves to signal to each other. Clinical trials had shown that it could boost cognitive performance, but only modestly in patients with Alzheimer's disease. We should also discuss genetic tests, I continued, to see if we can discover why you might have developed Alzheimer's at a young age. I went over what a positive genetic test result might entail. It could provide an explanation for Trish's condition, but it also had implications for her family, including her children, because it could mean that they too were going to develop the disease. We had learned of these implications from a remarkable extended family in the state of Antioquia, Colombia. This kindred comprises approximately 5,000 people, of whom some 1,500 are known to carry a mutation in the PSEN1 presenilin 1 gene that is inherited in an autosomal dominant manner. This means that anyone carrying a single copy of the mutated gene will develop Alzheimer's with 100% certainty. The protein that the gene codes for affects how amyloid is handled by cells. Mutations in the gene lead to increased levels of amyloid aggregating to form plaques in the brain, which ultimately result in dementia. Tonagawa's research team at MIT had demonstrated that it was possible to improve memory recall in mice who had mutations in the very same gene by activating the hippocampal engram memory neurons. 17 In addition, their experiments revealed, quite astonishingly, that it was possible to plant false memories by stimulating these neurons. 18 A scenario which is perhaps analogous to the phenomenon of confabulation in patients. With the advent of genetic testing, it was possible to discover in the Colombian family precisely who was going to develop Alzheimer's and who wasn't, years before they would normally develop symptoms. The same, I thought now, might also apply to Trish's children. But my parents didn't have Alzheimer's, she told me. How could that be if I have a genetic condition? Well, we don't know yet whether you have a genetic mutation, I said, sidestepping the question. Trish's father, it turned out, had died in his 40s in a car accident, so it was possible he might have gone on to develop the same disease as his daughter now had. In the Colombian family, some research suggests that the mutation might have been brought to South America by a Spanish conquistador in the 1600s. But the exact nature of the genetic causes of young-onset Alzheimer's disease in that country has turned out to be more complex than originally thought. Another mutation in the PSEN1 gene seems to have been brought to Colombia from Africa, possibly by someone who was enslaved. I don't think I want my kids to know if they're going to get this. If it really is Alzheimer's, Trish responded, maintaining her skepticism. So, I'd rather not have any genetic tests. Thank you. We didn't pursue that line of investigation further. I could see that Trish was in some degree of denial about her diagnosis. There was no point in pressing it home. I simply gave her a pamphlet which provided some information on Alzheimer's disease and where she might find reliable information, including from counselors who work with young dementia patients. What about your work? I asked. What do you mean? Trish responded, the note of defiance clear in her voice. I think it might be important to have a discussion with your employers, especially if you've been making mistakes. Sooner or later, one of those could be serious. So, the mistakes have been a few minor things. I'll think about it. Trish interrupted, making light of matters and clearly not wanting me to pursue this. I'm afraid I'm also going to have to ask you to inform the driving agency and your motor insurance company about the diagnosis. They might write to me for more details. That as well. I'm sorry, but this is a legal requirement. I gave Trish a prescription for donepezil and arranged to see her in a few months. Before I had finished explaining when we would reassess her, she asked, by the way, do you have the results of my brain scan yet? This is exactly what Steve had meant about repeating questions and forgetting new information over a period of a few minutes. I went through the test results again. As she left, Trish shook my hand, but she clearly wasn't convinced there was a problem or by the diagnosis I was making. I didn't feel confident that she understood the full significance of what I had said. If either of you, have any more questions, please do send me an email. I said, I'd be very happy to answer them. We could arrange a call. Thank you, doctor, said Steve. And then, let's go and have a chat over coffee, he suggested to Trish, trying to be comforting. It'll be a fine hot chocolate for me, Rockefeller, she insisted with a wicked smile. I'll not be short-changed on that. I was obviously looking bewildered. Trish has a weakness for cocoa from a specialty shop in Soho, Steve explained. It's not a bloody weakness. It's a strength, Trish retorted. He really doesn't understand hot chocolate. Doctor, it's medicinal, she chuckled. It'll be my cure, that's for sure. Tilda oh Tilda. Leaving the hospital that evening, I wondered how the conversation had gone between Trish and Steve when they got to the cocoa shop in Soho. More importantly, how would they cope over the next few months? She seemingly in denial and in such good spirits. He, obviously exasperated but trying to be supportive. The bus I was on was going past the Physic Garden on its way towards Sloane Square in Chelsea. From the top deck it was difficult to make out any details. Darkness had cloaked the gardens in a deep indigo inscribed with vague, darker dendritic forms in the middle distance. First established by the Society of Apothecaries to grow medicinal plants, the Physic Garden is a haven in modern London. But in the past, it was an extremely busy place through which plants from around the world were introduced to Britain. I smiled, thinking about Trish and her hot chocolate while passing. This place led to the peculiar recollection of Sir Hans Sloane, one of 18th century London's most famous physicians, and the great benefactor of the Chelsea Physic Garden. It was he, too, who has often been credited with bringing chocolate from Jamaica in a form that was appreciated by the English palate. By mixing it with hot milk and sugar, Sloane supposedly introduced hot chocolate to London, a beverage which, as Trish herself surmised, was believed to have healing properties. Certainly, apothecaries at the time set great store by its medicinal attributes, leading to the spectacular rise of the drinking of hot chocolate in Britain. Sloane himself was busier with ambitions far grander than hot chocolate. Born into the very modest home of a tax collector in what is now Northern Ireland, he most remarkably went on to become physician to 3 English monarchs, Queen Anne, George I and George II, as well as being president of both the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal Society. His wealth grew thanks to his marriage to Elizabeth Langley Rose, who had inherited profitable sugar plantations in Jamaica, and with this money Sloane had set about collecting all sorts of plants and objects from around the world. Ultimately, his legacy, undoubtedly built on money made from slavery, led to the birth of no less than the British Museum, as well as to a host of London streets and locations, including Sloane Square, being named after him. Despite how he made his money, Sloane did have an astonishing career, breaking into the inner circles of London society and successfully becoming a leading figure within those circles when he was from a very modest background in Ireland. Indeed, some historians conclude that since his provincial Irish brogue would have been considered quite barbaric in polite society, he must have relinquished his accent very rapidly in order to make the extraordinary ascent he did. He was an outsider who knew how to operate so well, in fact, that he became a leading insider. As Isaac Newton Riley commented, Sloane was a very tricking fellow. 19. My bus had now reached the embankment. The glistening black expanse of the Thames was illuminated by the graceful arcs of lights suspended over the majestic Albert Bridge. It was time for me to get off. I wondered how often Trish was going to be sipping high-end hot chocolate in Soho from now. I next saw Trish 4 months later. When I spoke to Steve on his own, he thought that perhaps there had been some improvement after we had started her on the donepezil medication. But it was mild. Trish was still experiencing difficulties remembering important information, and this was becoming even more evident at work, he said, where her employers were very concerned about her continuing. There was pressure on her to resign. Life outside work was also changing. Trish had a lively, close group of friends, but she was now seeing less of them. It was apparently her decision rather than theirs. Steve thought it was because she was finding it increasingly challenging to follow their conversations. He'd noticed when the friends had visited their home that Trish would often have no recollection of the people or events the group was discussing. She appeared to be lost, bewildered in the midst of the fast-flowing chat and clearly feeling excluded, whereas previously she had usually been the focus of attention, the person cracking the jokes. It seemed like she might have been confabulating with them too. Sometimes she would say things that they looked puzzled by. But Trish wasn't one for pity and had decided not to mention anything about the possible diagnosis. However, Steve had noticed that she was now feigning other commitments when her friends organized nights out and was slowly losing her connections with them. Worse still, Trish had succumbed to a scam telephone call from someone supposedly selling timeshare properties in Spain. She had lost over £8 by handing over her bank details. Steve was fighting to get this money back, but her children were very annoyed. They'd accused Trish of being incompetent and had argued fiercely with her. Now they weren't speaking to her, but Trish still hadn't told them anything about her diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. She wanted to remain independent, even if this meant becoming estranged from her family. Steve was finding it more and more difficult to cope with the situation. To be frank, Doctor, I'm not sure I can continue in this way. She just won't listen to me when I say we have to tell people so that they'll understand. I can't really carry on with her if she doesn't. Steve was clearly at the end of his patience. If Trish were to lose him, she would become even more isolated. When I brought her into the consulting room to speak to her alone, it was evident that she was still persisting with shrugging off the diagnosis. To be honest with you, I don't understand what all the fuss is about, she said. People forget, don't they? They do. Then we're agreed, she interjected. I'm wasting your time, aren't I now? No, that's not what I think at all, I responded quickly. You're definitely not wasting my time. Everybody does forget, but I'm afraid you're forgetting a lot more than most people. And it's not just your memory that seems to be affected. It is difficult to be blunt, but it's necessary if someone doesn't seem to be acknowledging they have a problem. Trish's face narrowed. How do you mean? She asked accusingly. She was clearly worried that Steve had said things that she'd rather he hadn't. I wasn't going to avoid the issue. Look, I said, as calmly as I could. I've heard about the fact that you've also made some bad decisions lately, like the money you lost in the scam. That can happen to anyone, Trish retorted. It can, I said softly, but it hasn't happened to you before. Well, there's always a first time for everything, isn't there? She said, still defiant. I think the reason for many of the things that have been happening to you, at work, with your group of friends and with other people, might have something to do with the fact that you have Alzheimer's disease, I said slowly. The room fell into silence. Trish turned away. For a moment I thought she was about to storm out, but she looked back at me, her eyes glassy. There was a little opening of her lips. Then she began to sob, quietly. I know, I've just been so frightened, she explained, tears now coursing over her hollow, pale cheeks. I went to pass her a box of tissues, but she took my hand and held it tight. We didn't say anything for several minutes. I've known there must be something wrong for a very long time. Doctor, she said at last, but I've been so worried that Steve and everyone else would abandon me if they thought I had dementia. I was startled by her explanation. I hadn't appreciated why she had been so strong-willed about not accepting a diagnosis. Now I knew she was scared and I hadn't realized. I felt awful, inadequate, and moved by how Trish had hidden her true sentiments. They're not going to leave you if they understand what the problem is. No, it's not your fault you have this condition. But you have to be honest with the people who love you. They care for you, but they have to understand what you have, and you might have to listen to what they say, especially Steve. He's trying his best, but he's finding it very difficult because you don't seem to acknowledge there is a problem. Thank you for telling me, she said, nodding her head. I know I will have seemed really ungrateful, but I do appreciate all that you've done. Thank you for telling me the truth. She gave me a tight squeeze of the hand, then wiped away the tears from her face. Trish's response in coming to terms with her diagnosis had been denial, but this very act was threatening to make her situation worse with the people who loved her the most. When Steve came into the room, he was alarmed to see how distressed Trish looked, but she smiled reassuringly, got up and gave him a very long hug. It's all right. I know I have Alzheimer's and I also know that you're amazing, doing all the things you do for me, she announced to Steve, who couldn't disguise how taken aback he was. Let's go for some cocoa, she said with a smile. It turned out that admitting there was a problem helped everyone, including Trish. She stepped down from her job, which had become hugely stressful for her. When she explained her diagnosis to her children, they were apparently both shocked and ashamed about the way that they had behaved. They became far more sympathetic and supportive of their mother. Trish's friends, too, were also very understanding once they realized why she was so different. They gave her space to talk in their conversations and found that if she was given sufficient time, her sense of humor could still be extremely funny. I had also learned a lesson. Denial of a diagnosis, especially one that is going to change someone's life, isn't simply about being obstructive. It can be due to a very real fear of what that diagnosis will mean for the relationships we hold most dear.